Tonight, we turn our gaze to the burning sands and the crowded, divided streets of the early 20th century Middle East, to examine a story of profound national humiliation and the slow, calculated mechanics of a revolution. To truly understand the massive tectonic shifts that redrew the geopolitical map of the Arab world, you must first understand the suffocating, heavy shadow cast by the British Empire over the nation of Egypt. By the 1930s, Egypt was technically officially recognized as a sovereign, independent monarchy. But this independence was a hollow, bureaucratic illusion carefully managed by politicians sitting thousands of miles away in London. The brutal, undeniable reality of the global economy dictated that whoever controlled the narrow, strategically vital waterway of the Suez Canal effectively controlled the lifeblood of the British global empire. The canal was the massive, heavily fortified artery that connected the factories of Great Britain directly to the immense, lucrative colonial wealth of India, and the British government was unwilling to entrust that artery to the actual people who lived around it. So the British military remained entrenched on Egyptian soil, keeping tens of thousands of heavily armed, disciplined soldiers permanently stationed in the canal zone, projecting a constant threat of overwhelming violence over the sovereign nation. The capital city of Cairo was a place of staggering inequality, physically divided into two separate isolated worlds that essentially never interacted. In the lush, heavily watered districts of the city center, wealthy European expatriates, British military officers, and a tiny, privileged elite of Egyptian aristocrats lived in insulated luxury. They spent their evenings in exclusive, beautifully manicured private clubs, speaking French and English, disconnected from the grinding poverty that characterized the lives of the vast majority of the population. Just a few miles away from the quiet, elegant gardens of the elite, millions of native Egyptians lived in overcrowded, unsanitary slums, while the rural farmers, known as the fellahin, worked the ancient agricultural lands along the Nile in conditions that had barely changed since the era of the pharaohs. The nominal ruler of this fractured, volatile society was King Farouk of the Muhammad Ali dynasty, a monarch who had ascended to the throne in 1936 as a popular, handsome teenager, carrying the desperate hopes of the Egyptian people. The public had genuinely believed that the young king would finally stand up to the suffocating arrogance of the British High Commissioner and restore the historic, cherished dignity of the Egyptian state. But Farouk collapsed under the isolating pressures of his office, rapidly degenerating from a promising national symbol into a figure of grotesque, embarrassing public decadence. He spent vast sums of the national treasury on luxury cars, private yachts, and endless trips to the heavily guarded casinos of Europe, abandoning the grueling, necessary administrative work of governing an impoverished nation. His political impotence was finally exposed to the entire world on February 4, 1942, in an event that would permanently shatter the psychology of the Egyptian military. The British government, terrified that the approaching armored columns of Nazi Germany might seize the Suez Canal, demanded that King Farouk immediately appoint a pro-British prime minister to guarantee the compliance of the Egyptian state. When Farouk mildly, cautiously hesitated, the British ambassador, Sir Miles Lampson, simply ordered massive, heavily armed British tanks and motorized infantry to surround the royal Abdeen Palace in the dead of night. Lampson marched past the humiliated, outgunned royal guards, walked directly into the king's private study, and explicitly threatened to force Farouk to abdicate the throne right then and there if he did not immediately submit to British demands. The king, terrified and powerless, instantly signed the papers, proving to every single Egyptian citizen that their monarch was nothing more than a well-paid, pathetic hostage of a foreign military. The Abdeen Palace incident sent a severe shockwave of unadulterated shame through the ranks of the Egyptian army. radicalizing a generation of young officers who felt they had been forced to witness the violation of their own nation. Among the millions of frustrated, angry citizens internalizing this national trauma was a quiet, brooding young man named Gamal Abdel Nasser, the eldest son of a rural postal worker. Nasser had not grown up in the wealthy, insulated palaces of the Cairo elite. His childhood was spent moving frequently between small, dusty provincial towns and the crowded, vibrant streets of Alexandria. He possessed an observant, analytical mind, and he had spent his teenage years participating in massive, dangerous student protests against the British occupation. In 1935, during a violent, chaotic anti-British demonstration in Cairo, a British bullet grazed his forehead, leaving a permanent, visible physical scar that he would carry for the rest of his life. But Nasser was a practical, calculating thinker, and he slowly realized that throwing rocks at heavily armed British soldiers and shouting slogans in the streets was useless. He understood that political power in a colonized nation did not flow from student protests or beautifully written newspaper editorials. It flowed from the organized, disciplined application of military force. For generations, the officer corps of the Egyptian army had been strictly reserved for the sons of wealthy, land-owning aristocracy, a cynical policy designed to ensure that the military remained loyal to the king and the elite. But in 1936, recognizing an urgent need to expand the size of the armed forces, the Egyptian government passed a consequential administrative reform that opened the Royal Military Academy to young men from the lower and middle classes. It was an accidental, fateful bureaucratic loophole that handed the armed keys of the kingdom directly to the young men who harbored profound resentment toward the ruling class. Nasser immediately seized the newly opened opportunity, entering the Royal Military Academy in 1937, where he began to quietly, methodically surround himself with other frustrated, ambitious cadets from similar working-class backgrounds. He did not speak loudly about revolution, he did not openly insult the king, and he did not attract the paranoid attention of the royal secret police. He was a master of profound patience, choosing to bide his time, study military strategy extensively, and observe the systemic institutional rot consuming the high command of his own army. He knew that the entrenched British Empire could not be wished away, and he knew that the bloated, corrupt royal government would eventually collapse under the weight of its own historical incompetence. All that the young, driven officer needed was a public, undeniable geopolitical disaster to expose the vulnerability of the old order. And as the 1940s drew to a violent close, that exact catastrophic disaster was rapidly unfolding across the narrow, contested borders of the Sinai Peninsula, when the heavily armed, exhausted British military finally decided to abandon its mandate over the volatile territory of Palestine in the spring of 1948. It left behind a profound, terrifying geopolitical vacuum. The sudden, chaotic withdrawal of the imperial administration immediately triggered a massive, desperate war between the newly declared State of Israel and a disorganized, uncoordinated coalition of neighboring Arab armies. In Cairo, sitting in the quiet, insulated luxury of the royal palaces, King Farouk viewed the escalating conflict not as a complex, dangerous military challenge, but as a cynical, convenient public relations opportunity. The king was rapidly losing the support of the frustrated Egyptian public, and he genuinely believed that a swift, publicized military victory in Palestine would instantly restore the fading, compromised prestige of his collapsing monarchy. He ignored the frantic, desperate warnings of his own chief of staff, General Mohammed Haidar, who explicitly, bravely informed the royal court that the Egyptian army was unprepared to fight a modern, mechanized war. Farouk simply dismissed the generals, relying on the wildly inaccurate, arrogant assumption that the Arab armies would simply march into the territory and secure a bloodless victory within a matter of days. On May 15, 1948, The Egyptian army was officially ordered to cross the border and march directly into the scorching, contested sands of the Negev desert, lacking any coherent strategic objective. The young, ambitious officers leading the infantry battalions, including a 30-year-old major named Gamal Abdel Nasser, suddenly found themselves thrust into a massive, chaotic military campaign that possessed no functional logistics. The sheer, terrifying incompetence of the high command became immediately, brutally obvious the moment the lead columns crossed the frontier, because frontline officers quickly realized they had not even been issued standardized military maps. In a profound, authentic historical failure that perfectly captured the rot of the royal administration, Egyptian battalion commanders were actually forced to navigate the unfamiliar, treacherous desert terrain using commercial tourist guides and outdated railway schedules. But the lack of proper intelligence was merely a minor administrative inconvenience compared to the lethal, unforgivable reality of the ammunition they had been issued by the Royal Ministry of Defense. As Nasser and his men engaged in their first heavy firefights with the motivated, entrenched Israeli militias, they discovered that a large percentage of their artillery shells simply failed to detonate upon impact. Even more terrifying, the infantrymen frantically pulling the pins on their hand grenades in close quarters, combat frequently found that the weapons would prematurely, violently detonate in their own hands, instantly killing the very soldiers trying to throw them. This was not a tragic, accidental logistical oversight. It was the direct, undeniable result of a massive, organized criminal grift orchestrated by the closest, most trusted political allies of King Farouk. The men inside the king's inner circle had deliberately, secretly purchased cheap, defective, decommissioned World War II scrap munitions from the abandoned battlefields of Europe, hastily repainted them, and sold them to their own military at an astronomical, fraudulent markup. The royal elites sitting in the wealthy, insulated cafes of Cairo were actively, knowingly building vast personal fortunes at the expense of the young, working-class soldiers bleeding into the sand just a few hundred miles away. Major Nasser, sitting in the cramped, suffocating heat of a forward command trench, watched his own men die from defective equipment and felt a profound, crystalline rage replace his traditional, ingrained military discipline. He realized with cold, unforgiving clarity that the young soldiers under his command were not being outfought by a superior enemy. They were being actively, systematically murdered by the greed of their own government. Despite the fatal logistical handicaps, Egyptian junior officers fought with desperate bravery, managing to push their columns deep into the southern Negev desert throughout the early summer. But the Israeli High Command, recognizing the underlying structural weakness of the overextended Egyptian supply lines, launched a massive, coordinated counteroffensive in October of 1948, historically known as Operation Yoav. The mobile, aggressive Israeli armored units executed a brilliant tactical pincer movement, severing the single, vulnerable coastal road that served as the primary supply artery for the advanced Egyptian positions. Suddenly, thousands of Egyptian soldiers, including the entire 6th Infantry Battalion where Nasser served as Chief of Staff, found themselves surrounded and cut off in a small, exposed crossroads town known as Al-Fallujah. The situation inside the Fallujah pocket almost immediately degenerated into a grueling, horrific struggle for basic human survival. As harsh, freezing winter rains transformed deep defensive trenches into rivers of freezing, toxic mud, the 4,000 trapped Egyptian soldiers were stripped of their supply lines, rapidly burning through their meager rations and surviving on rationed, contaminated drinking water. The medical situation became a traumatizing nightmare, with small, exhausted surgical teams forced to perform mass battlefield amputations without anesthesia. Working in dark, flooded basements under constant artillery fire. Israeli forces, eager to force a rapid surrender and free their combat units for other fronts, subjected entrenched Egyptian soldiers to a relentless, psychologically exhausting barrage of heavy artillery and constant psychological warfare. Israeli planes dropped thousands of printed leaflets over the freezing, starving Egyptian trenches, explicitly listing the names of trapped Egyptian officers, including Nasser, and politely, firmly urging them to surrender to avoid unnecessary annihilation. Yet back in the insulated, heavily censored capital of Cairo, Royal State Radio continuously, proudly broadcast fabricated stories of sweeping Egyptian military victories, lying to the public about the reality of the encirclement. Nasser listened to cheerful, delusional state broadcasts on a crackling field radio while sitting in a bombarded trench. Realizing the royal government was willing to let 4,000 men slowly starve to death simply to avoid the political embarrassment of admitting defeat, the commander of the trapped Egyptian forces, a respected, stubborn officer named Brigadier General, said Taha, commonly known by his men as the Sudanese Tiger, refused to consider surrender. Taha explicitly commanded his exhausted, starving officers, including his adjutant Major Nasser, to rebuild shattered defensive earthworks every single night, ensuring every Israeli attempt to storm the pocket was met with devastating, coordinated machine gun fire. The fierce, unexpected resilience of the Fallujah pocket shocked the Israeli high command, who rapidly realized a direct, aggressive frontal assault on entrenched Egyptian positions would yield unacceptable Israeli casualties. This tactical stalemate led to one of the most profound, surreal, consequential diplomatic encounters of the entire war, a meeting that would alter the geopolitical trajectory of the entire Arab world. On November 11, 1948, the local Israeli commander, a pragmatic, intelligent officer named Yigal Allon, dispatched a formal envoy across mined front lines under the strict protection of a white flag. The Israeli delegation politely requested a direct face-to-face meeting with Egyptian command staff, offering to suspend heavy artillery bombardment to allow both sides to discuss an honorable, respectful military capitulation. Brigadier General Taha, closely accompanied by Major Nasser and a small contingent of suspicious Egyptian officers, walked slowly out into the center of the shattered, cratered no man's land to meet their adversaries. The meeting was professional, devoid of the venomous political rhetoric that defined public conflict, for it was a conversation between frontline soldiers who understood the horrific, unglamorous reality of war. Israeli officers politely, firmly explained the undeniable hopelessness of the Egyptian tactical situation, pointing out that Moscow and London would not intervene, and that the royal government in Cairo had abandoned them. They offered starving Egyptian soldiers a generous, honorable surrender, promising the men would retain personal dignity, receive immediate medical care, and be safely repatriated to Egypt once hostilities officially concluded. Nasser sat quietly in the cold, dusty command tent, closely observing confident, competent Israeli officers, and made a profound, analytical observation that shifted his entire political worldview. He noticed Israeli commanders integrated closely with their frontline troops, sharing identical physical risks, wearing identical muddy uniforms, and fighting with unified national purpose. He mentally contrasted this functional, egalitarian military culture with bloated, corrupt Egyptian generals, who remained thousands of miles away in the guarded luxury of Cairo's Shepherd's Hotel, disconnected from the blood and mud of the Negev. Brigadier General Taha listened to the logical, practical Israeli surrender offer, slowly stood up, adjusted his soiled uniform, and politely rejected the proposal, stating that the honor of the Egyptian army could not be purchased with food. As Egyptian officers marched back into the freezing mud of the Fallujah pocket, fully expecting eventual death from starvation or artillery fire, Nasser felt no sense of impending doom. Instead, he felt a clarifying wave of uncompromising purpose, realizing the fundamental tragedy of the Egyptian people was not the presence of the Israeli army, but the moral bankruptcy of the royal government. He began to quietly, obsessively document his thoughts in his small, worn field diary by the faint, flickering light of a kerosene lamp. Ignoring the terrifying concussions of Israeli artillery shells landing just above his bunker, he wrote analytical, philosophical entries about the undeniable betrayal of frontline troops, identifying the corruption mechanisms that allowed royal elites to sabotage national defense for personal profit. Within the dark, suffocating confinement of the Fallujah pocket, the abstract, vague political frustrations of his youth crystallized permanently into a rigid, actionable revolutionary ideology. Nasser recognized that confronting a complex external enemy was impossible when the state's internal structure rotted systematically from the inside out. The pivotal psychological epiphany he reached in the freezing mud was later summarized in an iconic phrase shared with his closest confidants. He famously concluded that the Egyptian army was besieged in the Negev, but the true siege surrounded their entire nation, and the real unavoidable battle lay not in Palestine, but in Cairo. By early 1949, the uncoordinated Arab military coalition had collapsed, forcing the humiliated royal government in Cairo to formally seek an immediate, unpopular armistice with the newly established State of Israel. Under the strict, supervised terms of the General Armistice Agreement, starving, traumatized survivors of the Fallujah pocket were officially permitted to march out of their fortified trenches and return to Egyptian territory. Desperate for a manipulative public relations victory, the royal government attempted to welcome returning 6th Battalion survivors as triumphant national heroes, ignoring months of state abandonment. When Major Gamal Abdel Nasser finally stepped off the train in Cairo, his uniform hanging loosely on his emaciated frame, he looked past the loud, orchestrated cheering crowds and artificial, cynical smiles of royal politicians. He was no longer merely a frustrated junior officer blindly following flawed orders from a decaying, incompetent monarchy. Total betrayal had transformed his perspective entirely. He returned to the unequal capital city with cold, unforgiving patience. Bearing traumatic memories of defective weapons and unmedicated battlefield amputations in his observant mind, the horrific, prolonged crucible of the Fallujah pocket forged a disciplined political force. A man who understood that to save Egypt's failing state, he must sever its corrupt leadership. As Nasser slipped back into the anonymous shadows of Egypt's sprawling military bureaucracy, he immediately began laying the secret, complex foundations for the dismantling of the Muhammad Ali dynasty. When the surviving officers of the Palestine campaign finally returned to the bustling, unequal streets of Cairo in early 1949, they were forced to step back into a society that refused to acknowledge the reality of their defeat. King Farouk, desperately attempting to maintain the fragile illusion of royal supremacy, ordered the state media to portray the returning soldiers as victorious, decorated conquerors, ignoring the logistical nightmare they had just survived. But behind the polished doors of the royal palaces and the quiet, manicured gardens of British diplomatic compounds, the political police were aggressively expanding their domestic surveillance network. The Royal Secret Police, an organization possessing vast, unchecked legal authority and thousands of embedded civilian informants, understood perfectly well that frustrated returning army officers represented a massive volatile threat to the crown. They actively monitored quiet conversations in military cafes, meticulously intercepted the private mail of junior officers, and maintained constant surveillance on anyone who had openly criticized the royal supply chains during the war. Gamal Abdel Nasser understood the terrifying efficiency of this surveillance state, recognizing that a traditional, openly declared political movement would simply be arrested, quietly tortured, and dismantled within a matter of days. To successfully overthrow a government that held a monopoly on intelligence gathering, he realized he had to construct an organization that functioned in the shadows, built upon a flawless, rigid architecture of total compartmentalization. He began to quietly, methodically assemble a clandestine network that would eventually be known as the Free Officers Movement, designing it with the cold mathematical precision of an experienced military tactician. The fundamental survival of this conspiracy relied on a strict, unbreakable cellular structure, deliberately engineered to ensure that no single member possessed enough information to betray the entire network if they were captured and interrogated. Nasser organized recruits into isolated, five-man cells, where each junior officer only knew the specific identities of the four other men sitting directly in his own designated operational group. Only the designated leader of each individual cell was permitted to communicate with a slightly higher, equally isolated tier of command, ensuring that the vast majority of the conspiracy had no idea who sat on the Supreme Executive Committee. Nasser himself operated as the quiet, invisible architect, sitting at the center of this massive, complex web, deliberately avoiding the spotlight and actively portraying himself to his superiors as a diligent, unremarkable staff officer. The actual mechanics of recruitment were executed with psychological, ritualistic precision designed to test the loyalty of a potential candidate long before official induction into the movement. A senior free officer would spend months quietly socializing with a targeted young lieutenant, casually discussing rural poverty, royal court corruption, and the bitter, unspoken memories of defective weapons in Palestine. If the young officer demonstrated genuine anger toward the monarchy and willingness to risk his own life to change the nation's trajectory, the senior recruiter would eventually invite him to a secure, anonymous safe house in the dead of night. The recruitment ceremony was a theatrical exercise in psychological commitment, conducted in a darkened room illuminated only by a single small desk lamp. The recruit was instructed to place his right hand firmly upon a copy of the Quran, while a heavy, fully loaded military service revolver was silently placed on the table beside the holy book. In the heavy silence of the dark room, the young officer would solemnly swear unwavering allegiance to the Free Officers Movement, explicitly accepting that betrayal, information leaks, or hesitation would result in immediate death. This solemn oath bound the young men politically, morally, and spiritually, creating a disciplined, unbroken chain of loyalty that evaded the royal secret police surveillance net for nearly 3 years. But securing unwavering loyalty from young infantry officers was only the first phase of organizing a national revolution. Nasser realized the movement needed to systematically undermine the king's psychological authority, eroding the traditional public reverence Egyptians held for the Muhammad Ali dynasty. To shift public perception, the Free Officers launched a coordinated psychological warfare campaign, writing and distributing thousands of anonymous, inflammatory political pamphlets to military barracks and civilian universities. Producing subversive documents in a city blanketed by secret police required intricate logistical work to conceal a loud piece of industrial equipment. The Free Officers acquired a manual, hand-cranked Gestetner mimeograph machine, a cumbersome device that reeked of industrial ink and produced a distinct rhythmic clacking noise when operated. Knowing secret police monitored dissidents' electricity usage and listened through thin Cairo apartment walls, Nasser ordered the mimeograph machine relocated systematically every few days. Junior officers wrapped the machine in thick wool blankets to muffle sound, loaded it into borrowed civilian cars after dark, and transported it to random, vetted safe houses across the city. They operated the machine by hand in the freezing early morning hours, producing thousands of detailed, analytical documents, exposing financial corruption among the king's closest advisors. These pamphlets, boldly titled The Voice of the Free Officers, were slipped into military overcoat pockets, left on officers' club tables, and mailed to senior government officials' private residences. The royal government grew infuriated by the pamphlets, launching aggressive raids on capital printing presses. Failing to recognize the documents were printed on a mobile, constantly relocated machine. By late 1951, the Free Officers' clandestine structure had penetrated nearly every major Egyptian military installation, establishing loyal cells in armored divisions, the Air Force, and critical signals intelligence units. But as Nasser reviewed hidden ledgers of his invisible army, he identified a fatal structural flaw in his revolutionary strategy. The Free Officers consisted of men in their late 20s and early 30s, holding low-tier ranks of major and captain, with no broad public recognition. Nasser understood core diplomatic realities. A takeover by unknown radical junior officers would not be recognized as a legitimate national revolution by the international community. British forces still garrisoned the Suez Canal zone with tens of thousands of combat-ready troops, and would label the action an illegal military mutiny. London would leverage the coup as a geopolitical pretext to redeploy armored columns into Cairo, claiming to restore order and reinstate their compliant puppet king. To prevent devastating British intervention, the Free Officers needed a decorated, respected senior general to serve as the reassuring public face of the revolution. They needed a senior ranking officer who could project calm stability to anxious Egyptian civilians and suspicious foreign embassies. A figure embodying traditional conservative military statesmanship. Nasser systematically reviewed senior command personnel files, eliminating dozens of decorated generals compromised by royal corruption or invested in preserving the existing political order. He ultimately focused on 51-year-old infantry commander Major General Muhammad Naguib, a man with an unblemished, respected military reputation. Naguib was not a calculating political strategist like Nasser, but a traditional pipe-smoking career officer wounded 3 times while leading frontline troops in the Palestine War. He was beloved by enlisted soldiers for his bravery, respected by civilians, and harbored quiet resentment toward King Farouk over the logistical betrayals that radicalized junior officers. Nasser dispatched his most charismatic trusted deputies to cautiously approach the general, testing his political loyalties without revealing the full scope of the armed conspiracy. Alienated by royal court corruption and sympathetic to junior officers' grievances, Naguib cautiously agreed to align his prestigious reputation with the hidden reform movement. But planning high treason with unforgiving logic, Nasser knew a private pledge of support from a senior general was not enough to guarantee coup success. He needed to publicly test Naguib's standing within the armed forces and demonstrate to the arrogant royal court that junior officers possessed the organizational power to humiliate the monarchy. A pivotal opportunity for this political test arrived in December 1951, during the symbolic, contested internal elections for president of the Egyptian Military Officers Club. For decades, the club presidency had been a prestigious ceremonial role reserved for loyal, decorated senior generals handpicked by King Farouk. Determined to retain control over the military hierarchy, the king publicly nominated Hussein Seri Amr, a corrupt, unpopular general. General Amr was despised by junior officers. Widely known as the royal sycophant who protected corrupt arms merchants responsible for defective wartime ammunition, Nasser recognized the election was not a trivial administrative vote, but a visible proxy battle for the soul of the Egyptian armed forces. He ordered the Free Officers' invisible cellular network to mobilize all members, directing every loyal major, captain, and lieutenant to support Naguib against the king's candidate. Young officers moved across military barracks nationwide, spreading word in mess halls through untraceable communication lines, built over 3 years of shadow operation. They eschewed violence and incendiary pamphlets, relying on disciplined coordination to execute a calculated political maneuver. On election night, the ornate Cairo Officers' Club voting hall filled with hundreds of service members, under the watch of royal intelligence agents. When ballots were tallied methodically by the election committee, the result sent a paralyzing shockwave through royal palace halls. Backed by the organized invisible network of junior officers, General Mohammed Naguib defeated the king's hand-picked candidate in an undeniable landslide victory. The unprecedented electoral upset marked a bloodless legal mutiny that shattered the illusion of royal control over the military. Confined within Abdeen Palace luxury, King Farouk seethed at the unexpected humiliation, instantly realizing an organized dissident force operated within his own military. Driven by spite and paranoia, the king refused to validate the election results, suspended the Officers' Club Administrative Board, and ordered the secret police to root out all conspirators. By nullifying a legal military election, the king made a catastrophic miscalculation that accelerated the very revolution he sought to prevent. Farouk proved to every hesitant, moderate officer that systemic reform within the existing regime was impossible. He transformed a hidden shadow movement into a cause with unassailable moral legitimacy, validating Nasser's core conviction that the monarchy required removal by force. From his modest Cairo home, Nasser received reports of aggressive royal police raids and recognized years of patient shadow preparation had reached its end. The cellular structure held firm mimeograph propaganda had eroded royal public support, and General Naguib provided the credible public figure the movement needed. Yet royal paranoia accelerated the revolution's timeline, disrupting the measured takeover schedule Nasser had originally drafted. With secret police closing in and suspect lists expanding rapidly, the Free Officers' small, isolated executive committee faced impending confrontation. As Nasser prepared his shadow army for a coordinated military strike against the royal palaces, Cairo's fractured civilian population stood ready to erupt independently. Public resentment suppressed by British occupation and ignored by corrupt royal rule was poised to explode into unmanageable crisis. The calculated mechanics of the military conspiracy were set to collide with unfiltered public rage, paving the way for a destructive turning point in modern Cairo's history. While the Free Officers quietly calibrated the delicate mechanics of their military conspiracy in the dark, the occupied Suez Canal zone was rapidly devolving into a terrifying zone of unmitigated guerrilla warfare. By late 1951, the Egyptian civilian government, desperately attempting to channel boiling public anger away from domestic corruption, had officially, unilaterally abrogated the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936. This sudden diplomatic maneuver explicitly declared the British military presence along the strategic waterway a hostile, illegal foreign occupation, stripping British forces of their legal right to remain on Egyptian soil. This political declaration acted as a visible green light for loosely organized, armed civilian militias, quietly supported by sympathetic local auxiliary police, to launch relentless, daily sabotage attacks against British military installations. British logistics convoys were violently ambushed on isolated desert roads. Heavy water filtration plants were systematically sabotaged, and tens of thousands of Egyptian civilian workers walked off their jobs, paralyzing the administrative infrastructure of the imperial base. British military command in the zone, operating under the aggressive, uncompromising leadership of General George Erskine, decided to brutally restore logistical control by executing a public display of overwhelming military force. General Erskine focused his cold, armed attention on the strategic city of Ismailia, specifically targeting the main headquarters of the Egyptian Auxiliary Police, a paramilitary force known locally as the Buluk Nizam. British intelligence officers correctly identified that these lightly armed Egyptian policemen were actively, systematically providing crucial tactical intelligence, stolen ammunition, and secure safe houses to civilian guerrilla fighters attacking British supply lines. On the freezing, tense morning of January 25, 1952, General Erskine ordered a mechanized British strike force, supported by heavy Centurion battle tanks and armored personnel carriers, to surround the police compound in Ismailia. The British delivered a strict, non-negotiable ultimatum to the outgunned Egyptian police commander inside the compound, demanding that his 800 men surrender their weapons, abandon their posts, and evacuate the canal zone immediately. Staring out at the heavy main guns of British Centurion tanks pointed directly at his brick building, the Egyptian police commander placed a frantic telephone call to the Ministry of the Interior in Cairo. The Minister of the Interior at the time was Fuad Serijden, a wealthy, corrupt aristocrat who was reportedly resting in a warm, luxurious morning bath inside his Cairo mansion when he received the desperate transmission from the surrounded police garrison. Detached from the armored reality of the standoff and eager to posture as a fierce nationalist for domestic newspapers, Serijden ordered the police commander to refuse the surrender demand. He commanded lightly armed auxiliary policemen to fight armored British forces to the last man, ordering 800 troops armed with outdated bolt-action rifles to fight an unwinnable battle against modern tank artillery. When the British ultimatum deadline expired in the crisp morning air, heavy Centurion tanks rotated their turrets and began systematically, ruthlessly firing high-explosive 20-pounder shells into the fragile brick walls of the police barracks. Egyptian policemen fought with desperate ferocity, holding their positions as artillery fire shattered ceilings and buried their colleagues under piles of burning rubble. The unequal, horrific firefight raged for 6 agonizing hours, filling Ismailia's streets with thick, choking dust and the mechanical roar of British machine guns cutting through plaster walls. When surviving Egyptian policemen exhausted their ammunition and emerged from the smoking, destroyed compound, the staggering cost of the minister's arrogant order became brutally apparent. 50 Egyptian policemen lay dead inside the shattered barracks, with another 80 severely wounded, leaving a traumatic bloodbath that shocked even hardened British combat veterans of the assault. In a profound cinematic moment of military respect, British troops formed 2 straight, silent columns and saluted surviving, bleeding Egyptian policemen as they marched out of the ruins into captivity. Yet the localized tragedy of the Ismailia massacre did not remain confined to the occupied canal zone. News of the slaughter spread rapidly across telephone lines into volatile, overcrowded central Cairo. The following morning, January 26th, a date etched permanently in Middle Eastern geopolitical history as Black Saturday, the capital awoke to a stifling atmosphere of unfiltered grief and rage. The tragedy triggered an unprecedented, terrifying collapse of law enforcement across the Egyptian capital. Thousands of furious Cairo policemen, mourning the unnecessary slaughter of their Ismailia colleagues, abandoned their posts spontaneously and marched into the streets to protest the corrupt government behind the massacre. By abandoning their security duties, mutinying police stripped the populous capital of its protective shield, leaving wealthy European districts defenseless. Simultaneously, unionized aviation workers at Cairo International Airport launched a disruptive solidarity strike, igniting a swelling wave of civilian protests. that flooded downtown commercial districts. What began as an emotional, disorganized political demonstration mutated systematically into a calculated urban arson campaign across the city. Organized groups of young men, armed with crowbars, gasoline canisters, and incendiary devices, moved with deliberate precision through wealthy European neighborhoods. They avoided random attacks on residential homes and local Egyptian businesses, targeting opulent commercial symbols of British imperialism and resented European aristocratic institutions. One of the first horrific targets was the exclusive, manicured Turf Club, a British-only social venue where colonial administrators and foreign businessmen gathered to drink imported gin and shape imperial policy. Mobilized crowds surrounded the elegant building, trapped terrified British civilians inside, and set the wooden structure ablaze, killing several senior British diplomats trapped in the inferno. Organized arsonists then shifted their destructive operation to Opera Square, focusing rage on luxurious commercial venues, catering to foreign elites. They shattered the plate glass windows of Groppi's, an elegant Swiss-owned café barred to Egyptian working-class citizens, dousing velvet furnishings and bakery interiors with gasoline before ignition. The ornate Rivoli Cinema, British-owned and reserved for elite audiences watching imported Western films, was gutted by fire within minutes. The terrifying climax of Black Saturday unfolded around the historic Shepherd's Hotel, the preeminent symbol of European colonial luxury across the Middle East. For nearly a century, the ornate terraces of Shepherd's Hotel served as an exclusive, protected social hub for visiting European royalty, British generals, and foreign aristocrats traveling across the empire. As oblivious foreign guests enjoyed catered lunches in decorated dining rooms, furious crowds smashed through the hotel's brass revolving doors. Rioters stacked wooden furniture, imported carpets, and soaked mattresses in main lobbies, dousing barricades with flammable kerosene before striking matches. The historic hotel erupted into a towering pillar of black smoke and roaring flames, forcing panicked wealthy guests to leap from upper balconies to escape the uncontrollable inferno. As the afternoon progressed, calculated political arson blended with unregulated chaos from impoverished civilians freed from civil law constraints. Tens of thousands of destitute residents from dense, unsanitary urban slums flooded burning commercial districts to loot shattered foreign department stores. Organized mobs dragged grand pianos, tailored European suits, and imported goods from wrecked storefronts. Overwhelming remaining fire brigades battling citywide blazes. More than 300 targeted commercial sites, including luxury boutiques, foreign banks, exclusive clubs, and automobile dealerships, were reduced to unrecognizable piles of black ash. Thick columns of black smoke blotted out the winter sun, casting a terrifying twilight over the capital, while roaring fire echoes carried for miles across the Nile. Yet, as the nation's administrative heart burned to the ground, the official responsible for national security remained paralyzed by personal decadence. King Farouk, confined within the fortified walls of Abdeen Palace mere miles from downtown's towering infernos, ignored the capital's apocalyptic destruction. The king hosted an opulent royal banquet for hundreds of loyal aristocrats, held to celebrate the birth of his infant son and heir, Crown Prince Ahmed Fuad. Farouk dined at a decorated head table using polished solid gold tableware, while terrified civilian ministers attempted to warn him that national civil order had collapsed. Corrupt Prime Minister Mustafa El-Nahas refused to deploy armed Egyptian forces to suppress riots, fearing orders to fire on civilian protesters would end his political career. Panicked royal authorities only authorized military deployment to restore order once evening. Shadows fell over smoking urban ruins. Military trucks carrying disciplined armed infantry rolled into shattered, looted commercial districts. establishing fortified checkpoints and enforcing a strict dusk-to-dawn curfew. By the time firefighters extinguished entrenched blazes the following morning, the catastrophic scale of economic and political destruction became undeniable. Tens of millions of pounds in foreign and domestic property was destroyed in a single afternoon, leaving impoverished Egyptian workers destitute and unemployed. The lawlessness of Black Saturday shattered the long-held illusion that the corrupt royal government possessed competent governance over the nation. Horrified by targeted destruction of British property and turf club fatalities, London immediately drafted classified contingency plans for armoured reoccupation of Cairo. From his shadowed private home, Gamal Abdel Nasser listened to crackling military radio reports and understood the unforgiving geopolitical mathematics of the burning city. Nasser and the Covert Free Officers Executive Committee had originally planned their military coup for 1955, scheduling years of incremental power consolidation within the armed forces. But the collapse of civil order on Black Saturday destroyed that cautious timeline, confronting the covert conspiracy with an unavoidable historical ultimatum. Nasser recognized that continued inaction would plunge the unstable, paralyzed nation into civil war or invite British military reoccupation of the capital. Monarchical decay had outpaced the revolution's structured planning, eliminating ideal conditions for a controlled strike. Immediate action became necessary, despite the risk of full network exposure, as Cairo's scarred, burning streets proved the Egyptian state had ceased to function. The intricate shadow infrastructure Nasser had built over 3 grueling, paranoid years required urgent activation before national collapse engulfed the conspirators. As strict military curfews settled over the traumatized, smoking capital, Nasser began issuing classified, consequential final orders to his network of cell commanders. The humiliating, compromised era of puppet kings and imperial oversight reached its violent breaking point. The analytical son of a postal worker prepared to surgically dismantle a dynasty that had ruled the Nile for over a century, paving the way for a disciplined military takeover that would reshape the future of the Arab world permanently. Nasser had recognized that waiting for a theoretically perfect geopolitical moment was no longer a luxury the free officers could afford, forcing him to rapidly advance the date of the military takeover to the sweltering, oppressive night of July 22, 1952. The overarching tactical blueprint for the coup relied on the element of synchronized surprise, designed to simultaneously sever the communication lines of the civilian government while capturing the senior military command structure before they could issue a single defensive order. Nasser assigned specific units from the 13th Infantry Battalion and the Armored Cavalry to execute the operation, issuing the final operational password, the single Arabic word Nasser, meaning victory, which was to be whispered at the military checkpoints to distinguish loyal conspirators from the royalist forces. He systematically dispatched junior officers to the private residences of their own commanding generals across the city, carrying strict orders to quietly arrest the senior leadership in their beds before they could mobilize the royal guards. But a military conspiracy involving hundreds of junior officers communicating across heavily populated barracks is mathematically impossible to keep watertight. And by the early evening of July 22nd, a fatal intelligence leak severely threatened the operation. An anxious young conspirator, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the impending treason, confessed the operational timeline to a fellow officer who immediately relayed this critical information directly to the Royalist High Command. This intercepted intelligence was routed straight to the King's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Hussein Farid, who frantically summoned every senior military commander in Cairo to an emergency, late-night strategic meeting at the Army's General Headquarters. Nasser was driving a borrowed civilian car through the dark, quiet streets of the capital, personally verifying the deployment of his armored units, when a loyal cavalry officer intercepted his vehicle and informed him that the High Command knew about the plot and was actively gathering to arrest them. Applying the cold, rigorous logic of a frontline combat veteran, Nasser did not abort the mission or disperse his forces into hiding, but instead realized that the enemy had actually made a catastrophic tactical error by concentrating their senior leadership inside a single, vulnerable building. Rather than waiting for the royalist generals to issue formal arrest warrants, Nasser immediately redirected an elite motorized infantry battalion, commanded by his closest confidant Abdel Hakim Amir, to launch a direct preemptive assault on the general headquarters. The royalist generals, sitting in a brightly lit conference room confidently discussing how to systematically hunt down the junior officers, had fundamentally failed to deploy any external security perimeter around their own compound. The free officers simply walked past the confused, lightly armed sentries, kicked open the heavy wooden doors of the conference room, and leveled their standard-issue Sten submachine guns directly at the chests of the Egyptian High Command. Without firing a single lethal shot, the apex of the royal military apparatus was forced to surrender their sidearms, paralyzed as they were quietly marched down the stairs and locked securely in the basement holding cells of their own headquarters. This flawless surgical decapitation of the military hierarchy eliminated the possibility of a coordinated loyalist counter-attack in the capital, ensuring that the heavy armored divisions stationed outside the city would receive no official orders to intervene on behalf of the king. By 2 o'clock in the morning on July 23rd, armed detachments of the free officers had systematically seized the central telegraph office, severed the telephone lines connecting the royal palaces, and locked down the vital strategic intersections leading into the wealthy government districts. The final, vital logistical objective was the Central State Radio Broadcasting Building, the only mechanism capable of instantly communicating the reality of the coup to the millions of citizens waking up across the country. The officer explicitly assigned to deliver the official revolutionary proclamation was Anwar Sadat, a theatrical conspirator who had ironically almost missed the operation because he had taken his family to a movie theater and was unaware that the timeline had been accelerated. Rushing into the secured radio station in the early hours of the morning, still wearing his standard military uniform, Sadat halted the regular programming, ordered the engineers to play military marching music, and seized the main studio microphone. Sadat did not announce that a clandestine group of radical junior officers had violently seized power, knowing that such a stark statement would trigger immediate domestic panic and invite aggressive intervention from the thousands of British troops stationed just miles away in the Canal Zone. Instead, Sadat read the carefully drafted manifesto strictly in the respected, universally recognized name of Major General Mohammed Naguib, explicitly framing the military takeover as a necessary, patriotic purge of corrupt officials rather than the destruction of the state. When the citizens of Cairo turned on their radios at 7:30 in the morning and heard that the men responsible for the defective weapons had finally been arrested by the beloved General Naguib, they did not riot, but poured into the streets in waves of jubilation. The British military intelligence officers, listening to the Arabic broadcast from their fortified embassy in Cairo, quickly analyzed the tactical situation on the ground and made a cold, pragmatic geopolitical calculation. Because the streets were peaceful, foreign property was untouched, and the coup was ostensibly led by a traditional conservative senior general, the British High Command concluded there was no legal or strategic justification to deploy their armored columns. King Farouk, who had been spending the sweltering summer months in the cool Mediterranean coastal city of Alexandria, woke up to discover that his capital city had been flawlessly stolen from him while he slept. Terrified and realizing that his personal royal guard was rapidly dissolving into mutiny, the king frantically fled to the massive, heavily fortified Ras El Tin Palace, an opulent royal fortress sitting directly on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The free officers, refusing to give the monarch any time to rally loyalist forces or formally request British military intervention, immediately ordered mechanized infantry units under the command of Zakaria Mohidin to drive up the desert road and surround Alexandria. The revolutionary forces systematically blocked every access road leading into the coastal city, severing the communication lines to the palace and ensuring the king could not physically contact the British garrison stationed nearby. There was a brief, tense exchange of automatic gunfire between the remaining royal guards and the revolutionary forces, resulting in 2 minor casualties, before King Farouk personally ordered his guards to cease fire, desperately attempting to save his own life. Inside the newly formed Revolutionary Command Council in Cairo, a fierce, volatile debate erupted among the junior officers regarding the ultimate physical fate of the captured king. Many of the more radical conspirators fiercely argued that Farouk had to be placed against a stone wall and executed by a firing squad, pointing to the historical precedents of the French and Russian revolutions to argue that leaving a deposed monarch alive was a fatal strategic error. They argued that a living king, even in exile, would serve as a constant rallying point for counter-revolutionaries, wealthy aristocrats, and foreign intelligence agencies seeking to restore the old order. Nasser rejected this violent, emotionally driven demand, utilizing a rigorous, pragmatic historical logic that perfectly demonstrated his profound understanding of international diplomacy and domestic stability. He argued that formally executing the king would spark an endless cycle of political bloodletting that would eventually consume the revolution itself, setting a dangerous precedent where every political dispute in the new republic would be settled by the firing squad. Furthermore, Nasser recognized that executing the monarch would instantly brand the free officers as bloodthirsty, uncontrollable radicals in the eyes of the global community, guaranteeing that the British and the Americans would intervene with overwhelming military force to restore order. He insisted that forcing the king to legally, publicly abdicate the throne and accept a peaceful exile would permanently destroy the moral authority of the monarchy without shedding a single drop of royal blood, neutralizing any international excuse for an invasion. Nasser won the debate through sheer logical attrition, convincing the council that a bloodless decapitation of the dynasty was the only mathematical path to securing the long-term survival of their new government. On the morning of July 26, the free officers delivered a formal, non-negotiable written ultimatum to the surrounded Ras El Tin Palace, demanding that King Farouk immediately abdicate the throne in favor of his infant son and depart the country before 6 o'clock that evening. Trapped inside the sprawling, empty palace, abandoned by the British diplomats who had once dictated his every move, Farouk requested the presence of the American ambassador, Jefferson Caffrey, to act as a neutral witness and guarantee his safe passage. Dressed in his full, heavily decorated white naval uniform, his hands visibly shaking with a mixture of terror and profound humiliation, the last ruling monarch of the Muhammad Ali dynasty sat at a simple wooden desk and signed the formal abdication decree. The Revolutionary Council permitted the deposed king to retain a shred of historical dignity, allowing him to board the royal yacht, the Maruza, the exact same historic vessel that had carried his grandfather, Khedive Ismail, into exile decades earlier. General Naguib actually boarded the yacht just moments before its departure, formally saluting the deposed king in a bizarre, polite exchange where Farouk warned the general that governing Egypt was a task that would prove vastly more difficult than simply seizing it. In a surreal, calculated display of military discipline and psychological control, the free officers ordered the coastal artillery batteries to fire a formal 20-owner gun salute as the royal yacht slowly pulled away from the Alexandria docks at exactly 6 o'clock. This heavy artillery salute was not a mark of genuine respect. It was a brilliant, cinematic broadcast to the watching world that the Egyptian military was firmly in control, capable of deposing a king with perfect, unbroken administrative protocol. As the Maruza steamed westward across the Mediterranean toward Italy, carrying the bloated, disgraced king and his heavy trunks of hastily packed gold, the psychological shadow that had dominated Egypt for 150 years formally evaporated. Within just 4 days, a clandestine network of junior officers had executed a flawlessly planned, bloodless coup d'etat, successfully overthrowing an entrenched monarchy without triggering a civil war or sparking a foreign invasion. The streets of Cairo were secure. The British troops remained quietly in their Canal Zone barracks, and the Egyptian public joyously celebrated Major General Mohammed Naguib as the brilliant, singular savior of the nation. But the grandfatherly general smiling at the massive, adoring crowds from the balconies of the capital was merely an effective, temporary instrument of political convenience designed strictly to shield the revolution from external intervention. Sitting quietly in the heavily guarded military offices, systematically reviewing the intelligence reports and mapping out the restructuring of the national government, was the true, undisputed architect of the July Revolution. Gamal Abdel Nasser had successfully captured the dying body of the Egyptian state, and he was now actively, methodically preparing to step out from behind the curtain to claim ownership of its future. When a secretive military conspiracy successfully overthrows a government, the immediate, most dangerous threat to its survival rarely comes from the deposed enemies, but from the fragile, unstable alliances forged in the shadows. Following the flawless, bloodless exile of King Farouk, the Egyptian public overwhelmingly projected all of their held national hopes onto the grandfatherly, pipe-smoking figure of Major General Mohammed Naguib, oblivious to the real mechanics of the revolution. Naguib enthusiastically embraced his newly assigned role as the savior of the nation, constantly appearing on the decorated balconies of Cairo, kissing the foreheads of young children, and genuinely believing that his immense public popularity equated to actual political power. But the true authority of the newly established republic resided within the guarded, windowless meeting rooms of the Revolutionary Command Council, a committee composed almost entirely of the original junior officers who had engineered the coup. Gamal Abdel Nasser sat at the head of this secretive council, acting as the Minister of the Interior, a strategic administrative position that granted him unfiltered control over the domestic police and the internal security apparatus. Nasser recognized that Naguib was rapidly mutating from a convenient, temporary political shield into a problematic, fiercely independent rival who possessed an incompatible vision for the geopolitical future of Egypt. The older general believed in traditional democratic institutions, arguing fiercely in the council meetings that the military had accomplished its primary mission of removing the corrupt king and should immediately return the nation to parliamentary civilian rule. Nasser and the young officers rejected this conservative philosophy, arguing that immediately reinstating the old parliament would allow the corrupt, entrenched landowning elites to financially manipulate the elections and legally steal the country right back. They believed that Egypt required a disciplined, uninterrupted period of authoritarian transition to systematically dismantle the feudal agricultural system, physically expel the armed British military, and rebuild the socio-economic architecture of the state. This profound structural ideological fracture between the figurehead and the architect finally ruptured in the early spring of 1954, resulting in a complex, ruthless political chess match known historically as the March Crisis. Naguib, attempting to leverage his massive public popularity to force the council's hand, unexpectedly submitted his formal, written resignation in late February, assuming that massive public protests would force the junior officers to beg him to return on his own democratic terms. Nasser immediately accepted the resignation, catching the older general off guard and officially placed Naguib under temporary house arrest, calling the dangerous political bluff. But Nasser briefly miscalculated the staggering depth of Naguib's popularity within certain traditional factions of the military, particularly the elite armored cavalry corps, who surrounded the Revolutionary Command Council headquarters and explicitly demanded the immediate reinstatement of the general. Facing an imminent armed military mutiny that threatened to shatter the fragile revolution, Nasser executed a brilliant, pragmatic tactical retreat, publicly reinstating Naguib to his official positions while secretly, systematically preparing to destroy the general's political foundation. Nasser leveraged his cultivated relationships with the massive Egyptian labor unions, quietly orchestrating a coordinated series of transport and transit strikes that paralyzed the commercial infrastructure of Cairo. At the exact same time, he deployed loyal, armed military units to systematically arrest the rebellious cavalry officers who had supported Naguib, severing the general from his last remaining pockets of physical military support. When the Nasser-funded civilian mobs filled the streets of the capital shouting orchestrated slogans demanding the continuation of the revolution and explicitly denouncing the return of the corrupt civilian politicians, the psychological war was decisively won. Naguib remained in his office, technically holding the title of president, but he had been surgically stripped of all actual administrative, military, and political power, reduced to a monitored hostage sitting quietly in his own presidential palace. Having successfully neutralized the internal threat of the figurehead, Nasser immediately turned his focus, calculating attention to the massive armed external threat that still physically occupied the sovereign territory of Egypt. Tens of thousands of British troops remained entrenched in the Suez Canal zone, and Nasser knew that the revolution would never possess historical legitimacy until the last foreign soldier physically boarded a ship and left the country. He initiated complex, secret diplomatic negotiations with the British government, understanding that a frontal military assault on the Canal Zone would result in unacceptable Egyptian casualties and likely trigger a full-scale imperial reinvasion of Cairo. After months of grueling, pragmatic geopolitical bargaining, Nasser signed the Anglo-Egyptian Agreement of 1954, formally securing a monumental, historic commitment from London to withdraw all British military forces from Egypt within 20 months. To the international diplomatic community, this treaty was an undeniable triumph for Nasser, achieving through quiet negotiation what decades of violent, chaotic street protests had failed to accomplish. But the fine print of the treaty contained a controversial, pragmatic compromise, explicitly allowing British civilian technicians to remain in the Canal Zone to maintain the military bases, and granting the British military the legal right to return if an outside power attacked the region. This nuanced geopolitical compromise infuriated the largest, most entrenched civilian political organization in the entire country, the secretive, conservative Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood possessed a massive disciplined membership consisting of hundreds of thousands of followers, a radicalized paramilitary wing, and an uncompromising belief that any treaty allowing even a single British civilian to remain was an act of high treason. The supreme guide of the Brotherhood, Hassan al-Hudabi, realized that Nasser was rapidly consolidating a secular, nationalist military dictatorship that would exclude the Brotherhood from establishing the Islamic State they had spent decades fighting for. The fragile, cautious alliance of convenience that had existed between the Free Officers and the Brotherhood during the coup evaporated, replaced by a dark, paranoid shadow war for control of the Egyptian street. The Brotherhood recognized that Nasser was the sole, indispensable architectural brain holding the entire military government together, and they concluded with cold, rigorous logic that removing him would cause the entire secular regime to collapse. On the warm, humid evening of October 26, 1954, Nasser traveled to the Mediterranean coastal city of Alexandria to deliver a massive, anticipated public speech in Manshia Square, celebrating the historic signing of the British Evacuation Treaty. Tens of thousands of enthusiastic, vocal citizens packed tightly into the sprawling public square, illuminated by heavy floodlights, surrounding the small, exposed wooden balcony where Nasser stood behind a pair of heavy microphones. Nasser was speaking with emotional intensity, explaining the long, painful history of the national struggle, unaware that a 32-year-old local tinsmith and committed member of the Muslim Brotherhood named Mahmoud Abdul Latif was quietly pushing his way through the dense crowd. Latif positioned himself precisely in the third row of the tightly packed audience, roughly 25 feet away from the wooden balcony, slowly reaching beneath his jacket to draw a heavy, fully loaded German Mauser semi-automatic pistol. Just as Nasser was passionately speaking about the dignity of the Egyptian people, Latif raised the heavy weapon, carefully aligned the iron sights directly with the center of Nasser's chest, and rapidly squeezed the trigger 8 consecutive times. The loud, sharp mechanical cracks of the gunfire instantly shattered the atmosphere of the square, triggering massive, chaotic panic as thousands of terrified citizens desperately threw themselves to the stone pavement. The heavy bullets violently shattered the thick glass fixtures hanging directly above the balcony, obliterated the wooden microphone stands, and severely wounded a government official standing just inches away from the Prime Minister. But in an inexplicable cinematic moment of mathematical improbability, every single one of the 8 bullets meant to kill Gamal Abdel Nasser missed his body. The security guards stationed on the balcony immediately desperately grabbed Nasser by the shoulders, attempting to pull him down to the floor to shield him from the barrage, demanding that he seek immediate cover. It was in this terrifying fraction of a second, with the heavy smell of cordite hanging in the air and the massive crowd dissolving into a terrified stampede, that Nasser's true genius for political theater crystallized. Instead of dropping to the floor or fleeing behind the heavy stone walls of the building, Nasser violently shoved his own armed bodyguards away, fiercely gripping the edge of the shattered wooden balcony, and stepped directly forward into the open. He leaned directly into the surviving damaged microphone, his voice booming with a raw, unscripted, terrifying emotional power that cut through the chaotic screaming of the panicking crowd. He demanded that the people remain in their places, shouting with defiant resolve, "Let them kill Nasser. For what is Nasser but one single man among you?" Knowing that the live radio broadcast was capturing every single word and transmitting it across the entire Arab world, he explicitly told the massive, stunned crowd that if he died that night, every single one of them must become Gamal Abdel Nasser, roaring into the microphone that he had instilled the unbreakable pride of independence into their blood. The staggering psychological impact of this spontaneous, fearless display of personal courage transformed Nasser from a quiet, calculating military bureaucrat into a living, untouchable mythological hero. The citizens in Manshia Square, realizing that their leader had refused to yield to a targeted assassination attempt, stopped fleeing, slowly stood back up, and began frantically cheering his name into the dark night sky. Nasser finished his emotional speech uninjured, quietly stepped off the balcony, and immediately utilized the horrific assassination attempt to execute the final consolidation of his political power. The failed bullets of the Muslim Brotherhood provided Nasser with the ultimate, undeniable legal and moral justification to dismantle the entrenched religious organization that had threatened his secular vision. Within hours of the shooting, Nasser ordered the military police to launch a coordinated nationwide dragnet, arresting thousands of suspected Brotherhood members, seizing their hidden weapons caches, and dismantling their entire paramilitary infrastructure. The Supreme Guide of the Brotherhood and the Senior Leadership Council were rapidly detained, subjected to rigorous, publicized military tribunals, and swiftly handed heavy prison sentences or executed, erasing the Brotherhood as a viable political threat for decades. But Nasser did not simply stop with the religious fundamentalists. He deliberately utilized the wave of public sympathy to permanently neutralize the final remaining fragment of the old political order. He ordered armed troops to quietly surround the presidential residence of General Muhammad Naguib, officially accusing the grandfatherly figurehead of possessing secret treasonous knowledge of the Brotherhood's assassination plot. Naguib was permanently stripped of the presidency, quietly removed from the capital, and placed under strict, isolated house arrest in a guarded villa outside Cairo, where he would remain silenced for nearly 30 years. By the end of 1954, the complex, dangerous internal power struggle that had threatened to consume the July Revolution had been decisively resolved by the quiet postal worker's son. The entrenched aristocracy was gone. The British military had formally agreed to evacuate the canal. The popular figurehead had been neutralized, and the massive religious opposition had been broken. Gamal Abdel Nasser stepped out from the shadowed architecture of the Revolutionary Command Council, officially assuming total dictatorial control over the vast administrative machinery of the Egyptian state. He was no longer just the secret architect of a quiet military mutiny. He had evolved into the undisputed master of Egypt, holding the loyalty of the armed forces and the passionate adoration of the civilian public. But the brilliant, ambitious new leader realized that simply governing the internal domestic affairs of Egypt was a limited geopolitical objective, disproportionate to the historical awakening he felt across the entire region. As he looked out past the fortified borders of the newly established republic, Nasser recognized that the entire Middle East was a fractured, vulnerable chessboard dominated by the competing interests of the Cold War superpowers. He began to quietly, methodically formulate a new, expansive political philosophy, an ideological framework designed to transcend the local borders of Egypt and appeal directly to the colonized masses of the entire Arab world. The calculating puppeteer had successfully seized the stage, and he was now preparing to rewrite the entire geopolitical script of the 20th century, utilizing an invisible, powerful technological weapon that would terrorize the traditional monarchs of the region. Having secured the unquestioned domestic authority of the Egyptian state by the end of 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser recognized a profound, geographically undeniable truth about his newly conquered domain. He understood that while Egypt possessed a massive population and a rich historical legacy, it was fundamentally constrained by its own harsh physical geography, reliant on a single river and surrounded by vast, unforgiving deserts. To guarantee the permanent survival of his revolution and to prevent resentful European empires from, he could no longer afford to operate strictly as an isolated, locally focused Egyptian nationalist. He needed to rapidly evolve into an influential regional hegemon capable of projecting political power thousands of miles beyond his own borders. To articulate this ambitious, expansive new geopolitical strategy, Nasser published a short, analytical booklet in 1954 titled The Philosophy of the Revolution, a text shaped by his close confidant, the brilliant journalist Mohammed Hassanein Haikal. Within the densely written pages of this manifesto, Nasser introduced a compelling theatrical historical metaphor, suggesting that the Middle East was an empty, chaotic political stage, waiting for a protagonist. He famously wrote that there was a consequential historical role wandering aimlessly through the Middle East, exhausted, searching for a heroic actor capable of stepping forward to claim it. Nasser declared that Egypt, by virtue of its unique strategic geographic positioning, was the only nation perfectly situated to step onto that stage and assume regional leadership. He rigorously mapped out this new sphere of influence, by introducing the geopolitical concept of the three circles, a calculated strategic framework that placed Cairo at the undisputed epicenter of the Arab, African, and Islamic worlds. The first and most vital circle was the Arab world, a fractured, volatile collection of newly formed states, artificially carved out of the old Ottoman Empire by British and French diplomats after the First World War. The second circle encompassed the vast colonized continent of Africa, where oppressed populations were beginning to agitate against their European masters, providing Cairo with the opportunity to fund and direct anti-colonial liberation movements. The third circle represented the broader Islamic world, a diverse global population that stretched from the Atlantic shores of Morocco to the archipelagos of Indonesia, offering a vast sympathetic religious audience. By conceptually linking these three massive spheres of influence, Nasser shifted the political orientation of the Egyptian state, transforming Cairo from a subservient colonial capital into the active beating heart of global anti-imperialism. But articulating a grand, expansive political philosophy on paper was useless unless the Egyptian state possessed a functional, effective mechanism to transmit that ideology into the minds of oppressed people across the region. Nasser recognized that traditional archaic methods of political communication, relying on printed newspapers, diplomatic envoys, and physical pamphlets, were insufficient for his regional ambitions. The vast majority of the Arab population in the 1950s was illiterate, impoverished, and cut off from the sophisticated urban political debates happening in capital cities. Furthermore, fortified, artificially drawn national borders separating Arab states were controlled by conservative, paranoid monarchies backed by British intelligence services, making the distribution of revolutionary literature a dangerous logistical nightmare. Nasser needed a penetrating weapon that ignored physical borders, bypassed armed customs checkpoints, and spoke directly to illiterate rural farmers and desert Bedouins in a language they instantly understood. He found this lethal geopolitical weapon in a disruptive new piece of commercial technology that began flooding global markets in the early 1950s. The sudden commercial production of cheap portable battery-operated transistor radios revolutionized the political dynamics of the entire developing world. Prior to the transistor, radio receivers were bulky, expensive, fragile wooden devices that required a stable electrical grid, limiting ownership to wealthy urban elites. But the small plastic transistor radio could operate for weeks on cheap batteries, allowing isolated rural populations without electricity to connect to political currents across the globe. Recognizing the staggering demographic potential of this technology, Nasser ordered the Egyptian government to subsidize the mass importation and domestic production of cheap transistor radios, flooding local markets with the devices. He then directed centralized state resources to construct some of the most powerful amplified medium and shortwave radio transmitters on Earth. On July 4, 1953, the Egyptian government launched a specialized aggressive international broadcasting network built to weaponize this technological shift, naming it Sawt al-Arab, or the Voice of the Arabs. This was not a sanitized state broadcasting service designed to read dry bureaucratic reports or deliver polite diplomatic greetings to neighboring monarchs. Voice of the Arabs was a sophisticated psychological instrument of political warfare, engineered to undermine the legitimacy of every Western-backed monarchy and colonial administration in the Middle East. The network was placed under the energetic control of a charismatic young broadcaster named Ahmed Said, who possessed a booming theatrical voice and intuitive understanding of mass emotional psychology. Said abandoned formal, archaic classical Arabic used by conservative state broadcasters, speaking instead in a passionate, accessible, dramatic register that resonated deeply with working-class masses. He addressed citizens of Iraq, Jordan, and the Gulf states not as foreign nationals, but as oppressed brothers in a unified Arab struggle, urging them to rise up and overthrow corrupt royal families that kept them in chains. To guarantee millions of listeners tuned in to these subversive messages, Nasser and said masterfully weaponized Egypt's cultural dominance in regional entertainment. Egypt hosted the most sophisticated cinema and music industry in the Middle East, and Voice of the Arabs framed its political broadcasts around popular, beloved music from the region's cultural icons. The centerpiece of this cultural strategy was legendary Egyptian singer Kulthum, whose emotive voice earned a level of mass adoration unparalleled in modern musical history. On the first Thursday night of every month, Kulthum performed a live broadcast concert from Cairo, an event so culturally significant that Arab city streets from Damascus to Baghdad emptied as crowds gathered around their radios. The Egyptian state used these unifying cultural broadcasts as an effective delivery system, ensuring audiences tuning in for music also received polished, anti-imperialist news bulletins during intermissions. The psychological impact of Voice of the Arabs shifted regional power dynamics, stripping traditional Arab monarchs of their monopoly over information flow. In Iraq, pro-British Conservative Prime Minister Nouri al-Said feared the destabilizing influence of Cairo's broadcasts, recognizing Nasser was turning Iraqi public opinion against its own government. Nouri al-Said ordered Iraqi intelligence to jam Cairo's radio frequencies, an expensive, futile effort easily overwhelmed by Egypt's powerful transmitters and superior wattage. In Jordan, when young King Hussein sought a subsidized security pact with Britain, Voice of the Arabs launched a personal rhetorical assault, labeling him a traitor to the Arab cause. The broadcast sparked violent civilian riots in Amman, forcing the panicked king to abandon the British treaty and proving Nasser could dictate sovereign nations' domestic policies without deploying a single soldier. Nasser's ideological reach extended beyond fractured Arab states into the second circle of his philosophical framework, targeting colonized territories across North Africa. In November 1954, a secretive militant group of Algerian nationalists launched an armed rebellion against France's century-old brutal colonial administration. The Algerian National Liberation Front, or FLNDN, was outgunned and isolated. Needing a recognized platform to amplify its anti-colonial struggle globally, Nasser immediately provided the FLN with logistical support, including guarded Cairo office space, smuggled Egyptian weapon caches, and access to Voice of the Arabs' powerful transmitters. Cairo radio broadcast incendiary, supportive messages to Algerian fighters in the Atlas Mountains, praising their armed resistance and calling for the expulsion of French military forces from Arab land. France, engaged in a costly counterinsurgency war in Algeria, resented Nasser's public intervention. Recognizing the broadcasts radicalized Algerian civilians and prolonged the conflict, French intelligence, the Stasi, viewed Nasser not as a regional nuisance but as an active terrorism sponsor dismantling France's colonial architecture in North Africa. By funding the Algerian rebellion and broadcasting targeted propaganda against British-backed monarchies in Iraq and Jordan, Nasser set Egypt on a collision course with Europe's two oldest, most powerful empires. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, working from the historic rooms of 10 Downing Street, developed a personal fixation on Nasser. Seeing the Egyptian leader as an existential threat to Britain's economic stability, Eden privately compared Nasser to Benito Mussolini, fearing the charismatic Egyptian leader would build a unified Arab superstate capable of cutting off Middle Eastern oil supplies to Europe. This paranoid panic in London and Paris validated the core geopolitical strategy Nasser had outlined in the philosophy of the revolution. by leveraging unaddressed anti-colonial resentment among Arab and African populations. Nasser transformed Egypt from a passive client state into an active, independent variable on the global stage. Projecting ideological power and defiant radio rhetoric ultimately required armored military capability to back geopolitical threats. Nasser knew that despite his regional popularity, Egyptian armed forces remained under-equipped, reliant on defective, obsolete World War II surplus weaponry. Israel, alarmed by Cairo's pan-Arab rhetoric, rapidly acquired advanced jet fighters and heavy armor from France. In February 1955, Israel launched an aggressive cross-border raid into Egyptian-controlled Gaza, a coordinated assault that destroyed an Egyptian military outpost and killed 38 Egyptian soldiers. The Gaza raid was a humiliating tactical disaster for Egypt's military, proving radio broadcasts alone could not repel a modern mechanized fighting force. Nasser understood that to survive the hostile regional environment he had fostered, he needed rapid military modernization, including heavy tanks, advanced radar systems, and supersonic jet aircraft. He initially approached the United States and Britain, requesting cash loans and military hardware to defend Egyptian borders. Western powers, frustrated by Nasser's refusal to join structured anti-Soviet military alliances such as the Baghdad Pact, responded with condescending, restrictive conditions. American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles held a binary Cold War worldview, believing neutral nations harbored communist sympathies. Dulles demanded Nasser sign restrictive, humiliating mutual defense treaties and submit Egyptian military operations to American advisor oversight in exchange for weapons. For Nasser, a proud independent nationalist who had spent his life expelling foreign military presence, allowing American advisors to dictate national defense policy was a non-negotiable red line. He recognized swapping British colonial domination for American military supervision was not independence, only a cosmetic shift in foreign oversight. Frustrated by Western diplomatic stonewalling, Nasser resolved to execute a radical, risky geopolitical maneuver to break the existing global order. He looked beyond Western diplomatic blocs, turning pragmatic focus toward the untapped industrial potential of the Soviet bloc. The Cold War global chessboard was divided between the United States and the Soviet Union, with established diplomatic rules forbidding developing nations from playing the two nuclear superpowers against one another. But Gamal Abdel Nasser, operating with unshakable confidence in unconventional political spaces, would prove the global diplomatic consensus wrong, paving the way for a landmark arms deal that reshaped global power balances. The fundamental geopolitical architecture of the Cold War in the early 1950s was built upon a rigid, paranoid binary logic that refused to acknowledge the existence of a neutral middle ground. In Washington and London, the senior foreign policy establishment operated under an unquestionable assumption that any developing nation that refused to explicitly ally with the West was intentionally preparing to defect to the Soviet Union. To lock down the Middle East and prevent the armored divisions of the Red Army from ever reaching the lucrative oil fields of the Persian Gulf, American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles devised a sweeping geopolitical containment strategy. Dulles relentlessly pushed for the creation of an armed, integrated regional military alliance known as the Baghdad Pact, systematically recruiting conservative, Western-backed monarchies in Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and crucially, the Arab state of Iraq. The inclusion of Iraq in this restrictive military alliance was a calculated, aggressive strategic maneuver by the British government, designed to isolate Egypt and elevate pro-British Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Said to undisputed leadership of the Arab world. Gamal Abdel Nasser viewed the Baghdad Pact not as a legitimate defensive alliance against Soviet aggression, but as a cynical, dangerous evolution of European colonialism, built to fracture Arab unity and keep the region permanently subservient to Western military commands. Nasser recognized that if he succumbed to diplomatic pressure and allowed Egypt to join the pact, he would invite the same foreign military domination he had spent his life expelling from Cairo. He immediately directed the powerful radio transmitters of Voice of the Arabs to launch a relentless propaganda campaign against the Iraqi government, denouncing Nouri al-Said as a corrupt, compromised traitor to the Arab cause. But while Nasser was winning the emotional psychological war on the airwaves, the undeniable reality of his under-equipped armed forces remained a vulnerable strategic liability. Western powers maintained a coordinated monopoly on the sale of advanced military hardware to the Middle East, formalized by the United States, Britain, and France in the Tripartite Declaration of 1950. This restrictive diplomatic agreement rationed the sale of basic ammunition and outdated tanks to Arab states, engineered to keep the Egyptian military dependent on Western logistical goodwill and weaker than the newly established State of Israel. American intelligence misread Nasser's ingrained independent character, believing it could bypass diplomatic hurdles through cynical financial bribery. In one of the most arrogant intelligence failures of the early Cold War, the Central Intelligence Agency dispatched senior operative Kermit Roosevelt to deliver $3 million in untraceable cash directly to Nasser's personal office. The condescending intention of the cash delivery was to personally enrich the Egyptian leader, operating under the assumption that, like prior corrupt monarchs, Nasser would pocket the funds and align his foreign policy with Washington. Nasser was profoundly insulted by the American presumption that his anti-colonial ideology could be purchased with a suitcase of money, and he responded with a pragmatic theatrical act of geopolitical defiance. Instead of returning the bundled cash or depositing it in a foreign bank account, Nasser funneled every American dollar into public construction of a towering concrete broadcasting antenna on Gezira Island in central Cairo. He officially named the structure Cairo Tower, designing it to resemble a lotus flower, while privately mocking the costly monument as Roosevelt's folly. A physical testament to Western bribery failure. Having rejected Western diplomatic coercion and financial manipulation, Nasser resolved to step outside controlled regional boundaries to rewrite Egypt's geopolitical standing. In April 1955, Nasser boarded a chartered plane and traveled to the Indonesian city of Bandung, marking his first trip outside the Middle East and African continent. The Bandung Conference was a historic gathering of 29 newly independent Asian and African nations, representing over half the global population, convened to reject the binary constraints of the Cold War system. Upon entering the crowded conference halls, Nasser stood as a recognized equal alongside influential anti-colonial titans including Jawaharlal Nehru of India and Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia. The most pivotal diplomatic encounter of the conference occurred when Nasser was introduced to Zhou Enlai, sophisticated premier of the People's Republic of China. Nasser held intense classified private talks with the Chinese premier, detailing Egypt's military vulnerability and Western refusal to supply advanced weaponry without compromising defensive treaties. Zhou Enlai listened with analytical focus, recognizing the geopolitical leverage to be gained by breaking the Western military monopoly across the oil-rich Middle East. Since Egypt lacked formal diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, Zhou Enlai served as a secure diplomatic conduit, promising to relay Egypt's urgent weapons request directly to Moscow's leadership. When the classified request reached windowless Kremlin offices, new Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev recognized an unprecedented opportunity to breach the fortified containment lines of the Baghdad Pact. For decades, the Soviet Union had failed to establish a political foothold in the Arab world, blocked by conservative religious monarchies and entrenched British intelligence presence. Khrushchev realized that arming the Arab world's most popular charismatic leader would plant Soviet influence firmly at the center of Middle Eastern geopolitics. In July 1955, influential Pravda editor Dmitry Shepilov traveled to Cairo under the bureaucratic guise of attending July Revolution celebrations. Shepilov bypassed monitored diplomatic channels to meet with Nasser, offering an unprecedented volume of Soviet mechanized weaponry with no restrictive political conditions or mandatory defense pacts. The scale of the proposed arms transfer promised to transform Egypt's outgunned military into the region's most technologically advanced armored fighting force overnight. The detailed logistical manifest included 200 modern T-34 battle tanks, 100 advanced self-propelled artillery guns, 2 naval destroyers, and several modern attack submarines. The crown jewel of the military package was full modernization of the Egyptian Air Force, slated to receive 120 fast, lethal MiG-15 swept, wing-jet fighters and 50 massive Ilyushin Il-28 tactical bombers. These armed jet aircraft outclassed the aging British Gloucester Meteors and French Dassault Mystiras operated by the Israeli Air Force, threatening to break the managed balance of power over the Sinai skies. Nasser was thrilled by the technological leap, yet he acknowledged a complex economic hurdle. Egypt's impoverished treasury held no Western hard currency to purchase the military hardware. Soviet negotiators resolved the financial barrier with a pragmatic macroeconomic solution, bypassing the regulated global banking system to accept payment in bulk shipments of high-quality Egyptian cotton by bartering agricultural staple goods for military survival equipment. Nasser neutralized the financial leverage Western banking institutions had long used to shape Egyptian domestic policy. To maintain plausible international deniability and avoid immediate military confrontation with the United States, the Kremlin avoided direct sales through Moscow. Instead, Soviet leadership utilized compliant industrial Eastern Bloc satellite state Czechoslovakia as the nominal weapons supplier, a diplomatic fiction remembered by history as the Czech arms deal. Throughout the tense summer of 1955, Nasser concealed the complex logistical details of the arms transfer from suspicious Western intelligence agencies stationed in Cairo. He leveraged the opaque military intelligence apparatus built during the revolution to hide hardware shipments, arriving at guarded Alexandria ports, under canvas tarpa. ULINs. The CIA and British CIS remained unaware of the unfolding geopolitical shift, assuming Nasser would eventually capitulate to Western demands out of logistical desperation. On the evening of September 27, 1955, Nasser chose a mundane, well-attended photography exhibition at the Cairo Military Museum to deliver his historic announcement. Stepping to the podium and setting aside prepared notes, he calmly informed stunned assembled diplomats and journalists that Egypt had signed a comprehensive commercial arms agreement with the Czechoslovakian government. The unexpected announcement sent paralyzing waves of geopolitical alarm through insulated power corridors in Washington, London, and Tel Aviv. John Foster Dulles faced humiliation from the massive intelligence failure. Recognizing his restrictive containment strategy had been surgically bypassed by a 37-year-old former infantry officer who weaponized Cold War rivalry, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden reacted with paranoid fury, acknowledging Nasser had dismantled the Western military monopoly shaping Middle Eastern politics since the Ottoman Empire's collapse. In the streets of Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, the announcement sparked an outpouring of Arab nationalist sentiment, cementing Nasser's status as the undisputed champion of the Arab world. He demonstrated to colonized, oppressed populations that defiance of Western coercive demands and survival against diplomatic retaliation were geopolitically possible. The Czech arms deal transformed positive neutralism from an abstract philosophical stance into a lethal, actionable geopolitical strategy. Nasser proved colonized developing nations were not forced to act as compliant pawns, manipulated by nuclear superpowers. He showed that by manipulating superpower anxieties between Washington and Moscow, an impoverished nation could leverage strategic geography to secure unprecedented military and economic concessions. Yet by inviting Soviet military logistics into the contested heart of the Middle East, Nasser escalated the geopolitical contest to an existential level, humiliated Western empires, unwilling to surrender long-standing dominance over the Suez Canal and regional oil reserves, began drafting aggressive plans for economic and military retaliation. As Soviet tanks rolled off transport ships in Alexandria to fortified desert borders, Nasser shifted focus from wartime preparedness toward his transformative domestic vision for Egypt. He knew jet fighters could defend national borders, but freeing vulnerable Egyptian populations from destructive Nile flood cycles required an unprecedented feat of modern engineering. Nasser prepared to risk the revolution's political capital on the controversial construction of a massive hydroelectric dam in southern Egypt, a complex infrastructure project that would entangle the nation in the decade's most explosive geopolitical crisis. For over 5,000 years, the fundamental rhythm of Egyptian civilization had been dictated by the volatile, unpredictable flooding cycles of the Nile River. Every single summer, the heavy monsoon rains in the distant Ethiopian highlands would send massive torrents of dark, silt-heavy water rushing northward through the desert, determining whether the nation would experience agricultural abundance or devastating famine. Gamal Abdel Nasser recognized that politically liberating his country from British occupation was largely symbolic if the vast majority of the Egyptian population remained wrapped in severe, agrarian poverty. To modernize the state and permanently break the brutal cycle of droughts and floods, Nasser became relentless in pursuing the construction of an unprecedented hydroelectric dam near the southern city of Aswan. The staggering engineering scale of the proposed high dam was breathtaking, requiring 17 times the volume of solid granite and concrete used to construct the Great Pyramid of Giza. Once completed, the massive structure would capture the annual floodwaters, creating a vast artificial lake that would expand Egypt's arable land by a full third and generate enough hydroelectric power to instantly electrify every single rural village in the country. But building one of the largest infrastructure projects in human history required an immediate infusion of foreign capital, estimated at roughly $1 billion, a sum absent from the depleted Egyptian national treasury. Nasser initially approached the World Bank, hoping to secure a traditional international development loan, which immediately drew calculated geopolitical attention from Washington and London. American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and British Prime Minister Anthony Eden reluctantly agreed to jointly fund the massive project. But their offer was laden with restrictive, humiliating economic conditions. The Western powers demanded the legal right to maintain continuous oversight of the Egyptian national budget, aiming to prevent Nasser from spending future capital on additional Soviet weaponry. While Nasser resented these suffocating financial terms, recognizing them as a covert form of the colonial control he had fought to expel, his desperation to build the dam initially forced him to continue the grueling negotiations. However, fundamental geopolitical friction between Cairo and Washington reached a toxic breaking point in May of 1956, when Nasser made a legal, sovereign diplomatic decision. Frustrated by continuous border clashes and eager to expand his access to global arms markets, Nasser formally extended official diplomatic recognition to the Communist government of the People's Republic of China. In Washington, The formal recognition of Beijing was viewed not as a pragmatic diplomatic maneuver, but as an unforgivable act of ideological treason against the Western alliance. Dulles, operating from a rigid, moralistic Cold War framework where geopolitical neutrality was considered a profound sin, decided Nasser required public humiliation to demonstrate the consequences of defying American foreign policy. On the afternoon of July 19, 1956, Egyptian ambassador to the United States Ahmed Hussein arrived at the State Department in Washington, prepared to formally accept the Western funding offer despite the restrictive conditions. Ambassador Hussein sat down in the heavy leather chair across from Dulles, confirming that the Egyptian government was ready to finalize the massive economic agreement and begin construction. Dulles avoided polite diplomatic negotiation, simply reaching across the polished wooden desk and handing the stunned ambassador a pre-written, insulting press release. The document publicly retracted the entire American funding offer, using patronizing language that questioned the fundamental stability and basic economic viability of the Egyptian state. Dulles deliberately orchestrated this sudden, visible withdrawal to maximize political damage to Nasser. Assuming the catastrophic loss of the dam project would shatter Nasser's domestic popularity and trigger a military coup in Cairo. News of the American withdrawal reached Nasser while he flew back to Cairo after a successful diplomatic summit in Yugoslavia with Josip Broz Tito and Jawaharlal Nehru. The Egyptian leader read intelligence reports detailing the arrogance of the American press release, and his initial profound shock hardened into cold, analytical rage. Nasser realized Dulles was not merely denying a construction loan, but publicly challenging the fundamental sovereignty of the Egyptian Republic, proving the West still sought to dictate the domestic future of the Arab world. Landing in Cairo, Nasser isolated himself in his private office, shutting out senior ministers while he meticulously reviewed national ledgers, searching for a domestic revenue source capable of single-handedly funding the high dam. His analysis focused on a lucrative commercial entity operating within sovereign borders, a historic corporation generating millions of pounds in annual revenue while contributing negligible funds to the Egyptian state. The Universal Company of the Maritime Suez Canal was technically registered as an Egyptian corporation, yet owned mostly by wealthy French stockholders and the British government, operating as an independent colonial state within a state. The canal company collected massive transit tolls from every cargo ship passing through the vital waterway, routing most profits directly to private banks in Paris and London while bypassing the impoverished Egyptian economy. Nasser calculated with precise accuracy that seizing control of the canal company and redirecting its annual revenues to the national treasury would fully fund the Aswan Haidar within 5 years. Executing a takeover of one of the world's most strategically vital waterways demanded absolute operational secrecy, as the slightest leak would trigger an immediate British military invasion from the Mediterranean. Nasser assembled a small restricted operational cell of trusted military engineers and intelligence officers, excluding most cabinet ministers from planning. Tactical command of the operation was entrusted to Colonel Mahmoud Yunus, a brilliant, disciplined military engineer who shared Nasser's cold, organized logistical approach. On July 24th, Nasser handed Yunus a sealed envelope holding classified tactical orders, instructing the colonel to travel quietly to the canal city of Ismailia with a small, unarmed detachment of military engineers. Yunus was forbidden from opening the envelope until the evening of July 26th, isolating the tactical team from broader geopolitical strategy. Nasser chose the operation's date for intentional symbolism, aligning it with a scheduled public speech in Manchuria Square in Alexandria, the site of the Muslim Brotherhood's 1954 assassination attempt against him. On the humid, tense evening of July 26th, over 200,000 passionate Egyptian citizens filled the sprawling coastal square. Energized by fallout from the American funding withdrawal, Nasser stepped onto the illuminated balcony, projecting calm, unyielding defiance. Knowing international diplomats and Western intelligence agencies monitored the live global radio broadcast, he opened his speech with a methodical, detailed historical overview, guiding the crowd through Egypt's long, painful history of European economic exploitation. He reminded the nation listening that the Suez Canal was built not by French capital, but by the bare hands of 120,000 impoverished Egyptian laborers who perished from cholera and exhaustion in desert heat. As Nasser built emotional momentum in Alexandria, Colonel Yunus and his small team waited in a secured Ismailia room, listening to the live transistor radio broadcast. Yunus opened the sealed envelope and read precise tactical instructions. His team was to seize Suez Canal Company headquarters the moment Nasser spoke a coded radio phrase. The prearranged code was a historical symbolic name woven into the speech, unrecognizable as a tactical signal to crowds and foreign embassy staff. Nasser leaned into the microphone, his voice booming across the square, transitioning his narrative to the French diplomat who had secured the exploitative canal concession from the Egyptian monarchy a century prior. He deliberately articulated the name Ferdinand de Lesseps, pausing to ensure amplified syllables transmitted clearly to the canal zone. Nasser repeated the name Ferdinand de Lesseps more than a dozen times in minutes, confirming signal receipt for the tactical team. In the quiet Ismailia room, Yunus heard the code word, stood formally, buttoned his military tunic, and led his team into the evening air. They walked calmly with unholstered sidearms through the glass entrance of Suez Canal Company headquarters, passing confused civilian security guards. With rehearsed administrative precision, Yunus's team secured communication hubs, maritime traffic control rooms, and financial vaults, informing stunned French and British executives of official Egyptian military control. Within 15 minutes of the coded signal, the vital, complex administrative infrastructure of the world's most critical commercial waterway had been seized bloodlessly by a small team of Egyptian engineers. Back in Alexandria, Nasser received a folded note from an aide confirming flawless tactical seizure of the canal zone. The analytical leader surveyed the anxious crowd, folded the note, and abandoned his measured historical tone. His voice rose into a rhythmic roar of national triumph, announcing the government gazette had formally published a new national law. He passionately declared the universal company of the maritime Suez Canal nationalized, with all assets, historical rights, and legal obligations transferred to Egyptian sovereign authority. The announcement struck the 200,000 attendees like a physical shockwave, drawing an unprecedented roar of unfiltered national euphoria. Nasser told the crowd canal revenues would no longer build private fortunes in Paris and London, but would fund construction of the Aswan High Dam. He mocked Western diplomatic arrogance days prior, inviting John Foster Dulles to stew in his own fury. Crowds in Alexandria and Cairo erupted in joyous celebration, weeping as they witnessed the final reclamation of a historic symbol of national subjugation. News of the sudden nationalization spread instantly across global teletype networks, delivering seismic geopolitical shock to Western European government offices. In London, Prime Minister Anthony Eden hosted a formal dinner for young King Faisal of Iraq when an aide whispered the devastating news. Eden lost his polished aristocratic composure, realizing Nasser had unilaterally severed a core lifeline of British imperial economics. A successful Egyptian takeover and independent management of the canal would shatter the long-standing myth of European administrative superiority across colonized nations worldwide. France, already engaged in a brutal, costly counterinsurgency against Nasser-backed Algerian rebels, viewed the nationalization as an existential act of economic warfare demanding military response. Dullies in Washington watched his calculated scheme to humiliate Nasser backfire spectacularly, elevating the Egyptian leader to prominent global status. Nasser had rewritten Cold War rules in a single masterful moment, turning diplomatic humiliation into one of the most popular political victories in modern Middle Eastern history. Yet by seizing the canal and threatening core economic lifelines of desperate, armed European empires, Nasser crossed an irreversible geopolitical threshold. Joyous street celebrations across Cairo concealed lethal military preparations, unfolding in fortified war rooms in London and Paris. European empires, fearing geopolitical irrelevance, refused to surrender historic dominance without violent pushback, preparing bomber fleets and elite paratrooper units for deployment. To execute this illegal imperial invasion, British and French diplomats sought a committed, armed regional proxy to launch a desert land offensive. They found a willing, capable military partner in anxious, well-armed Israel, forming a secret, cynical military alliance to dismantle the Egyptian revolution and remove Gamal Abdel Nasser from regional power. The secret diplomatic architecture designed to dismantle the Egyptian revolution was not constructed in the public halls of the United Nations, but inside a secluded, guarded suburban mansion known as the Villa Bonnier de la Mosson, situated in the quiet commune of Suez, just outside Paris. Between October 22nd and October 24th, 1956, an unprecedented gathering of senior diplomats and military strategists arrived at the French residence in unmarked vehicles, operating under fictitious names and strict radio silence. Representing France were Prime Minister Guy Mollet and Foreign Minister Christian Pineau. Representing Great Britain was Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd alongside Assistant Under Secretary Patrick Dean. And representing the State of Israel was Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, accompanied by his Chief of Staff Moshe Dayan and Director General Shimon Peres. The fundamental objective of the secret meeting was to synthetically manufacture an artificial international military crisis that would provide a defensible legal pretext for Britain and France to invade Egyptian territory, regain physical control of the Suez Canal, and permanently remove Gamal Abdel Nasser from power. The overarching logistical blueprint proposed by French strategists relied on a precise, mathematically timed three-stage choreographic maneuver that cynically weaponized international maritime law against Egyptian sovereignty. In the first stage of the conspiracy, Israel would launch a sudden, aggressive conventional land invasion across the Sinai Peninsula, deliberately driving its mechanized armored columns directly toward the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. In the second stage, precisely 24 hours after Israeli armor commenced its offensive, the governments of Great Britain and France would present themselves to the world as shocked, neutral maritime arbiters seeking to preserve freedom of global navigation. London and Paris would issue a simultaneous, peremptory ultimatum commanding both Israeli and Egyptian armies to cease hostilities and pull back all combat infantry to a strict demarcation line 10 miles away from either side of the canal waterway. The conspirators at Suez understood with logical certainty that Nasser could never voluntarily withdraw his troops 10 miles west of the canal, as obeying such an order would require him to unconditionally surrender the entire Sinai Peninsula and his primary commercial waterway to an invading foreign power without field. In a genuine defensive battle. When Nasser inevitably rejected the manufactured ultimatum, the third stage of the plot would instantly trigger, granting Anglo-French heavy bombing forces the pre-arranged diplomatic cover required to obliterate Egyptian military infrastructure. conduct massive amphibious paratrooper landings at Port Said, and forcibly occupy the entire length of the canal zone under the guise of international peacekeeping. During the intense whiskey-fueled debates inside the villa, David Ben-Gurion pushed back vigorously against Selwyn Lloyd, expressing indignation at the British demand that Israel act as the naked territorial aggressor, while Great Britain wrapped its imperial reinvasion in the sanitized cloak of moral law enforcement. To protect his nation from subsequent betrayal and condemnation by London at the United Nations, Ben-Gurion demanded that the intricate conspiracy be explicitly recorded on paper, signed in ink by the senior government plenipotentiaries of all three participating states. On October 24th, the parties signed the historical document permanently immortalized as the Protocol of Sèvres, committing Britain, France, and Israel to a synchronized timeline of coordinated warfare against the Republic of Egypt. So fearful was British Prime Minister Anthony Eden of leaving physical evidence of illegal international collusion that just hours after the delegation returned to London, he hurriedly dispatched Patrick Dean back across the English Channel with strict instructions to gather and burn all executed copies of the protocol. Ben-Gurion flatly refused to surrender Israel's signed counterpart of the treaty, securing the incendiary historical document within the private subterranean vault of his personal national archive, where it remained hidden from global diplomatic scrutiny for decades. At exactly 16 hours and 59 minutes on October 29, 1956, physical execution of the Sèvres timetable officially commenced with Operation Kadesh, as 400 elite Israeli paratroopers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Raphael Eitan dropped out of 16 Dakota transport aircraft directly into the approaches of the Mittler Pass, just 30 miles east of the Suez Canal. Simultaneously, mechanized Israeli armored brigades, substantially reinforced by recently delivered French light tanks and half-tracks, surged across the international armistice frontier in the Sinai, cutting through isolated Egyptian border garrisons at Abu Aguila and Qusayma. Egyptian armed forces stationed in the Sinai were unprepared for the speed of the mechanized thrust, as Nasser had deployed his most senior operational strategists and favored infantry battalions in the immediate vicinity of Cairo, anticipating that any foreign assault would naturally target the capital city rather than the deep eastern desert. In the central theater of the Mittler Pass, Israel's 202nd Paratroop Brigade, commanded by an ambitious lieutenant colonel named Ariel Sharon, initiated a brutal, controversial mechanized sweep straight into the defended canyon against entrenched Egyptian infantry holding fortified caves above the roadway. The resulting infantry combat inside the mountain defile was a grueling tactical bloodbath that cost Israel 38 dead and well over 100 wounded soldiers, while hundreds of Egyptian defenders fought tenaciously from higher elevations until their heavy ammunition supplies were exhausted by continuous Israeli mortar, fire and low-level French Mist-Syra aerial strafing runs. Back in Cairo, Gamal Abdel Nasser was monitoring the deteriorating tactical situation in the Sinai when, precisely on schedule on the afternoon of October 30th, British and French ambassadors arrived at the presidential offices to formally present their synchronized Anglo-French diplomatic ultimatum. Western diplomats demanded an immediate ceasefire and the physical withdrawal of all Egyptian armed detachments 10 miles westward from the canal banks within 12 hours, warning that failure to comply would result in immediate intervention by Anglo-French Joint Operational Command. Nasser scrutinized the exact territorial wording of the document, rapidly deducing that because Israeli troops had not yet even reached the eastern approaches of the waterway, an order for both armies to withdraw 10 miles from the canal effectively required Egypt to retreat from its own interior sovereign land while allowing Israeli invasion columns to advance unmolested to the canal edge. He turned to the British ambassador and formally rejected the demand, identifying the ultimatum not as an impartial instrument of international peacekeeping, but as an explicit act of coordinated armed robbery designed to hand the Suez Canal back to European corporate control. When the Anglo-French ultimatum formally expired on the evening of October 31st, Operation Musketeer was instantly activated, launching massive fleets of Royal Air Force Canberra and Valiant high-altitude bombers from colonial airstrips in Akrotiri, Cyprus, and Valletta, Malta. The primary operational directive of the initial aerial bombardment was to achieve total, uncontested air superiority across Egypt by systematically annihilating Nasser's newly purchased Soviet aviation infrastructure on the ground before it could be mobilized to defend the canal approaches. Thunders of precision-heavy ordnance rained down continuously across the sprawling concrete tarmacs of Almaza, Devassoir, and Cairo West airbases, methodically shattering dozens of parked MiG-15 fighter jets, Ilyushin Il-28 combat bombers, and strategic early warning radar installations. Egyptian military pilots, having only recently acquired Soviet flight manuals and lacking sufficient operational experience with advanced avionics systems, found themselves unable to launch coherent defensive interceptor squadrons through dense clouds of fragmented explosive shrapnel saturating their runways. Within 48 hours of relentless saturation, bombing from land-based bomber wings and reinforced carrier task forces steaming in the eastern Mediterranean, the operational capacity of the Egyptian Air Force ceased, leaving the sky above the Nile Delta open to low-level foreign interdiction. Confronted with catastrophic loss of sovereign airspace and recognizing a vast Anglo-French naval armada assembling off Port Said's coast, Nasser faced an agonizing definitive command dilemma that would define his survival as a statesman. He calculated that if he allowed his primary armored and infantry formations to remain pinned down deep in the Sinai Peninsula, engaging Moshe Dayan's Israeli column, N's imminent Anglo-French airborne landings at the canal's northern apex would sever the Egyptian army's single operational withdrawal line. Such tactical containment would isolate his finest combat battalions between an Israeli advance to the east and Anglo-French assault to the west, resulting in irreversible annihilation of regular Egyptian armed forces through classic military double envelopment. Demonstrating cold, pragmatic command of military survival tactics, Nasser abruptly ordered his chief of staff, General Abdel Hakim Amr, to abort all offensive desert operations and execute a rapid, fighting strategic withdrawal of every operational military detachment back across Suez Canal bridges toward the Nile Delta mainland. The resulting retreat from the Sinai under enemy air dominance was an organizational ordeal of grueling endurance, as thousands of Egyptian infantrymen abandoned immobilized supply transports to traverse burning desert dunes on foot while enduring constant strafing from low-flying enemy squadrons. By surrendering barren Sinai terrain to Israeli advances, Nasser conserved the functional core of his veteran infantry battalions, redeploying them within dense urban matrices of Cairo, Alexandria, and Northern Canal approaches to prepare for prolonged urban guerrilla attrition. Simultaneously, to neutralize London and Paris's core logistical pretext, that intervention was required to sustain maritime navigation for global commercial fleets. Nasser issued an uncompromising operational directive for full maritime infrastructure sabotage. Egyptian engineering crews, operating under emergency mandate from the Ministry of Marine Transport, boarded over 40 decommissioned coastal freighters, obsolete civilian tugboats, floating naval dry docks, and heavy dredging cranes moored along the full canal length. Engineers filled structural steel cargo holds with granite rock, industrial cement, and high explosive scuttling charges, positioning vessels perpendicular to primary shipping navigation channels. Through synchronized underwater detonations, engineering detachments scuttled the merchant fleet into deep navigational draft lines, driving steel hulls into sebaceous silt beds between Port Said and Suez. In less than 6 hours of controlled demolition, Nasser paralyzed the world's most vital commercial shipping route, converting open waterways into an impenetrable underwater obstacle field that halted Middle Eastern crude oil transit to Western Europe. Destruction of the navigation channel dismantled the invasion's foundational moral pretext, turning Eden's stated goal of protecting navigation freedom into a visible international diplomatic farce that outraged global maritime trading nations. Undeterred by waterway obstruction, Imperial Expeditionary Command proceeded with tactical amphibious Operation Telescope on the morning of November 5th, deploying elite elements of the British 3rd Parachute Battalion over El Gamil Airfield on the coastal spit west of Port Said. At the same hour, French colonial paratrooper commandos from the 2nd Colonial Parachute Regiment executed precision low-altitude jumps into Port Fouad's urban approaches and vital water control facilities at Raswa, south of the main city infrastructure. Anglo-French paratrooper detachments anticipated swift, uncontested administrative occupation of northern harbor complexes, relying on intelligence assessments predicting conventional Egyptian infantry would scatter under naval bombardment and vertical envelopment. Instead, invading airborne regiments faced determined, lethal urban defensive resistance organized by regular Egyptian infantry, fighting alongside thousands of motivated civilian volunteers. In the days before airborne assault, the Interior Ministry opened territorial weapon depots across Port Said, distributing thousands of bolt-action rifles, hand explosives, and surplus submachine guns to factory workers, dock mechanics, university students, and municipal police, newly armed civilian militias, operating under decentralized junior officer supervision, transformed dense Port Said urban architecture into a lethal combat zone with brick barricades and rooftop machine gun emplacements. When British 3rd Infantry Division and Royal Marine amphibious landing craft entered Port Said's commercial harbour on November 6th, advancing forces faced continuous, accurate small arms and sniper fire from overlooking apartment blocks and customs warehouses to clear operational routes through tight municipal road networks. Offshore British battleships and cruisers initiated devastating indirect naval bombardment, deploying hundreds of armor-piercing explosive rounds into downtown residential districts. Naval artillery damage triggered uncontrolled urban fires sweeping through congested civilian quarters, consuming residential structures and trapping thousands of impoverished families amid burning wreckage without clean water or medical aid. Despite widespread urban devastation, Egyptian defenders refused municipal surrender, forcing British tank and marine infantry units to clear every waterfront block through close-quarters combat, using flamethrowers and structural demolition charges. By mid-afternoon on November 6th, Anglo-French armored spearheads pushed beyond Port Said's burning perimeter and advanced south along the narrow, exposed canal road toward the critical railway junction at Al-Quantara. Tactically, Egyptian armed forces stood on the brink of military capitulation with no functional combat aviation for air defense, heavy infantry casualties in the Sinai, and destroyed northern port infrastructure. From traditional early 20th century warfare perspectives, combined industrial military forces of 3 modernized nations had defeated a developing state that challenged imperial economic hegemony. Yet as Gamal Abdel Nasser observed Port Said's burning ruins from his reinforced underground Cairo command bunker, he recognized a definitive shift in modern warfare's core geopolitical metrics. He understood British, French, and Israeli forces could destroy Egyptian armor and air bases on desert battlefields, Yet unprovoked colonial invasion had triggered a cascading diplomatic crisis, disrupting the global international order. By absorbing tripartite military aggression without surrendering executive authority or abandoning the national capital, Nasser lured invading governments into a fatal global diplomatic trap extending far beyond Middle Eastern regional boundaries. The Suez War's historical settlement was no longer decided by naval artillery shelling Port Said's docks, but by urgent, furious diplomatic correspondence emerging from the White House in Washington and the Kremlin in Moscow. When the mechanical roar of Anglo-French bomber squadrons finally subsided over the burning port facilities of the Canal Zone, the true epicenter of the Suez Crisis relocated instantly to the Oval Office in Washington. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was entering the final week of a domestic re-election campaign built around a platform of international peace, and he received intelligence reports of the European invasion with unyielding fury. The American president was outraged not merely by unprovoked military aggression against Egyptian sovereignty, but by calculated diplomatic deception perpetrated by British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who had concealed the Savres conspiracy from American intelligence. Eisenhower recognized the Anglo-French invasion provided the Soviet Union with a perfect geopolitical distraction, masking a concurrent Soviet tank division invasion of Budapest unfolding in Hungary that same week. Refusing to let European empires erode his diplomatic credibility across the developing world, Eisenhower directed his administration to orchestrate an unprecedented diplomatic alignment on the floor of the United Nations. American diplomats engineered a procedural maneuver to bypass British and French Security Council vetoes, shifting crisis deliberations to the General Assembly, where the United States aligned with the Soviet Union to demand immediate hostilities cessation. Acknowledging traditional diplomatic protests and UN resolutions could not halt advancing paratrooper battalions, the United States deployed a ruthless non-kinetic weapon against the imperial powers. The Eisenhower administration launched a devastating modern economic warfare campaign targeting fragilities within the post-war British financial system, which relied on fixed exchange rates and consistent dollar access to sustain pound sterling valuation. Upon invasion commencement, international currency speculators in New York and Zurich dumped British pounds on open markets, threatening to destabilize the currency valuation sustaining the British economy. Harold Macmillan, British Chancellor of the Exchequer, reviewed Treasury ledgers and confirmed the Bank of England had lost $85 million in gold and dollar reserves within the first days of combat. Macmillan appealed to Washington for emergency financial relief, petitioning the International Monetary Fund for over $1 billion in standby credit to stabilize the falling pound. Eisenhower instructed Treasury Secretary George Humphrey to execute precise financial pressure, ordering American IMF representatives to block British fund withdrawals until Egypt secured a full military ceasefire. Humphrey delivered a stark, non-negotiable financial ultimatum to London, threatening mass liquidation of American-held British sterling bond assets on open markets. This calculated financial maneuver would devalue British currency, bankrupt the United Kingdom, and cripple domestic food import capacity for the British population. Monetary pressure intensified amid disruptive logistical shifts across Middle Eastern energy networks, crippling Western European industrial capacity. In solidarity with Egypt, Syrian military engineers detonated explosive charges along key pumping stations of the Iraq Petroleum Company pipeline, severing the primary crude oil conduit to the Mediterranean Sea. Simultaneously, the Saudi Arabian government imposed a comprehensive oil embargo targeting Britain and France, ordering American-operated Aramco facilities to halt crude exports to invading nations. With the Suez Canal blocked by Nasser's scuttled vessels and overland pipelines destroyed in Syria, Remaining Middle Eastern oil shipping routes to Europe required lengthy, costly detours around Africa's southern cape. This extended maritime route inflated freight costs, triggered fuel shortages across London and Paris, and forced the British government to institute emergency civilian gasoline rationing for the first time since World War II. While the US Treasury undermined British financial stability, the Soviet Union seized a rare diplomatic opening to frame itself as an uncompromising defender of Arab sovereignty. On November 5th, Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin drafted stern, threatening diplomatic communiques and dispatched them to governing bodies in London, Paris, and Tel Aviv. Bulganin's telegram to Eden highlighted British geographic vulnerability, warning the United Kingdom faced catastrophic risk of attack from powers armed with modern destructive weapon systems. This deliberate reference to rocket technology marked the first Cold War instance of Soviet leadership brandishing intercontinental ballistic missile threats to force Western geopolitical concessions. CIA analysts reviewed Soviet communications and concluded Moscow lacked immediate capacity for coordinated nuclear strikes. Yet escalating rhetoric raised risks of accidental thermonuclear exchange. Eisenhower elevated Strategic Air Command alert levels to deter Soviet posturing, while delivering a firm message to London that American nuclear deterrence would not shield Britain from consequences of continued Egyptian occupation. Trapped between American financial collapse pressure and Soviet nuclear rhetoric, British Prime Minister Eden's psychological resolve fractured, battling chronic illness and diplomatic isolation from core allies. Eden unilaterally ordered British expeditionary forces to end offensive operations at midnight on November 6. Eden issued the order without consulting French military leadership, breaking Anglo-French operational cohesion and halting invasion progress. French Prime Minister Guy Mollet resented the sudden British surrender, as elite French paratroopers stood hours from securing Canal Zone tactical control. Without British naval and aerial logistical support, French forces could not sustain independent invasion operations, forcing Mollet to halt advancing battalions. Premature hostilities cessation left Anglo-French forces holding a narrow, strategically marginal perimeter around Port Said, surrounded by hostile Egyptian troops and stripped of diplomatic leverage over canal governance. To facilitate invading force withdrawal and diffuse superpower escalation, diplomatic negotiations shifted back to United Nations corridors in New York. Canadian Secretary of State for External Affairs Lester B. Pearson assessed the stalled crisis and recognized simple withdrawal demands would create a Sinai logistical vacuum capable of reigniting conflict. Pearson proposed an unprecedented institutional framework to separate combatants and stabilize international borders, drafting a resolution establishing the United Nations Emergency Force. The framework created a neutral, multinational, lightly armed contingent tasked with occupying the Sinai Peninsula and Canal Zone, overseeing foreign troop withdrawal, and preventing cross-border incursions. The General Assembly adopted the resolution enthusiastically, establishing the foundational model for modern UN peacekeeping and defining the role of blue-helmeted peacekeepers in monitoring ceasefires without territorial ambition. Peacekeeping force composition was structured to uphold political neutrality, integrating specialized military detachments from non-aligned nations including India, Colombia, Norway, and Yugoslavia to monitor buffer zones. For Gamal Abdel Nasser, stationed in his Cairo underground command bunker, the Pearson Resolution delivered unblemished geopolitical victory, mandating full unconditional evacuation of British, French, and Israeli troops from Egyptian sovereign territory. Nasser defined strict operational parameters for the UN emergency force, barring NATO-affiliated nations from participating in Egyptian peacekeeping deployments. He secured formal legal recognition that UN personnel operated exclusively under Egyptian government invitation, retaining sovereign authority to expel peacekeeping units at national discretion. Under international community oversight, humiliated Anglo-French naval forces re-embarked infantry units aboard amphibious assault ships in late December 1956, departing Egyptian coastal waters permanently. British military withdrawal concluded 74 years of continuous imperial occupation, fulfilling core Free Officers Movement objectives and validating Nasser's canal nationalization gamble. Anthony Eden, politically ruined by Suez conspiracy failure and British economic instability, resigned as Prime Minister in January 1957, exiting public office in historical disgrace. Israel, facing sustained American economic pressure and targeted sanction threats, agreed to withdraw armored divisions from the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip in March 1957. Israeli forces retreated to the 1949 armistice demarcation lines, dismantling Egyptian military infrastructure and damaging road networks during withdrawal to hinder future logistical capacity. Following foreign troop expulsion, the United Nations deployed salvage vessels and international engineering teams to remove concrete-laden block ships and sunken tugboats from primary shipping channels. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Lieutenant General Raymond Wheeler led the maritime salvage operation, deploying heavy-lift crane fleets to extract steel wreckage from underwater silt beds. UN-coordinated international funding covered full salvage costs, leaving the Egyptian government with no financial expenditure for waterway restoration and a fully operational maritime corridor. By spring 1957, Nasser retained administrative ownership of the Universal Company of the Maritime Suez Canal, diverting canal toll revenues into the national treasury to fund ongoing Aswan High Dam construction. As pledged during his Alexandria address, recognizing weakened European imperial standing post-crisis, Nasser implemented structural domestic economic transformation across Egypt. The Egyptian government seized hundreds of millions of dollars in private British and French corporate assets within national borders, nationalizing foreign-owned banks, insurance firms, and industrial manufacturing sectors. Comprehensive economic seizure eliminated European capital influence over the Cairo Stock Exchange, enabling Nasser to consolidate state financial architecture and advance his vision of Arab socialism. Survival against combined European and Israeli military power reshaped regional political psychology across the Middle East. Arab populations from Baghdad to Algiers overlooked tactical Egyptian defeats at the Mitla Pass, recognizing an Arab sovereign leader who resisted colonial pressure and forced imperial retreat through diplomatic resolve. Nasser emerged from Port Said's ruins with regional prestige unmatched since Saladin's era, evolving from tactical military leader into a global symbol of Arab dignity and post-colonial liberation. Voice of the Arabs radio broadcasts framed imperial withdrawal not as a Cold War side effect, but as legitimate triumph of unified Arab resistance. Nasser's portrait was displayed in Damascus storefronts, Palestinian refugee camp households, and student activist circles opposing conservative Gulf monarchies. He demonstrated the end of traditional gunboat diplomacy, proving developing nations could leverage international institutions, economic bottlenecks, and superpower rivalry to counter imperial military superiority. Suez Crisis victory strengthened the non-aligned movement, delivering a tangible model for African and Asian nations navigating superpower competition while preserving domestic sovereignty. For remaining British and French colonial administrators overseeing declining overseas territories, Egyptian survival signaled concluded imperial authority, accelerating continental African decolonization. Beneath this landmark political victory lay dormant structural vulnerabilities that would shape Nasser's subsequent administrative tenure. By embodying collective Arab aspirations, he established a fragile ideological standard where future diplomatic compromise or military restraint would be interpreted as betrayal of Arab collective interests. Regional populations perceived him not as a pragmatic state leader managing developing economic complexities, but as a revolutionary figure capable of delivering political progress through rhetorical leadership. This substantial psychological burden forced sustained displays of assertive leadership, drawing Egyptian foreign policy into complex regional conflicts to preserve standing as a core Arab resistance figure. As victory parades marched through liberated port-said streets, the former postal worker's son observed a transformed geopolitical landscape. Having secured national independence while tying his political fate to continental Arab demands, tactical combat in the Sinai had ended, yet the ideological struggle for Middle Eastern political identity had only begun, elevating Gamal Abdel Nasser to peak global influence with narrow margins for political error. When the diplomatic dust of the Suez Crisis finally settled across the Middle East in early 1957, the political gravity of the entire Arab world shifted toward the banks of the Nile. Gamal Abdel Nasser had transitioned from a quiet, calculating military conspirator into a towering, mythologized figure of regional defiance. He utilized Cairo's powerful voice of the Arabs transmitters to undermine neighboring Arab governments that aligned geopolitical interests with the United States or Great Britain. The unparalleled reach of his daily radio addresses granted Nasser more direct political influence over working-class citizens of foreign Arab nations than their own guarded monarchs. This unprecedented transnational popularity altered domestic political calculus across the Middle East, forcing traditional Arab leaders to appease mobilized Nasserist factions within their borders. Within Syria's fractured, unstable political landscape, Nasser's ideological victory triggered an internal crisis that reshaped Middle Eastern borders permanently. Syria in the late 1950s was an ungovernable, chaotic parliamentary democracy, paralyzed by toxic power struggle between two distinct armed political factions. One faction was the expanding Syrian Communist Party, led by charismatic, calculating Khalid Bakdash, who received steady financial and logistical support from the Soviet Union. The opposing faction was the nationalist, ideological Ba'ath Party, led by Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Bitar, who advocated pan-Arab socialism, yet lacked military force to seize state power. Ba'athist leaders recognized disciplined communist operatives were infiltrating senior Syrian military ranks to stage a supported bloodless coup in Damascus, seeking to neutralize impending communist takeover and secure political survival. Syrian military command executed an unprecedented geopolitical maneuver in January 1958. A secret military delegation of 14 senior Syrian officers, led by panicked Chief of Staff General Afif al-Bizri, flew uninvited to Cairo aboard a military transport aircraft. Syrian officers bypassed traditional diplomatic protocol, entered Nasser's presidential office, and demanded immediate unconditional political union between Egypt and Syria to form a unified Arab superstate. Nasser, governing with rigorous state-building logic, was stunned by the logistical absurdity of Syria's desperate proposal. He understood merging two distinct sovereign nations, divided by Israeli territory and the Mediterranean Sea, would create a dangerous administrative burden. Egypt maintained a centralized, agrarian, military-controlled economy, while Syria operated a capitalist system reliant on entrenched independent merchant classes in Aleppo and Damascus. Nasser informed the Syrian delegation that functional political union required 5 years of structured economic integration and gradual administrative alignment. Fearing imminent communist takeover, Syrian officers rejected gradual integration and pleaded for immediate unification to dissolve the Syrian state and eliminate communist threats. Recognizing newfound geopolitical leverage, Nasser tested the delegation's desperation by imposing 3 rigid, non-negotiable governing conditions. He demanded the Syrian military withdraw permanently from civilian politics, return to barracks, and relinquish its historic role as Syria's ultimate political arbiter. Second, he ordered immediate dissolution of all Syrian political parties, including the Ba'ath Party that had initiated Arab unification efforts. Finally, Nasser ruled the new republic would operate as a centralized, hierarchical government administered exclusively from his Cairo presidential office, rather than a loose equal federation. To Nasser's astonishment, the Syrian military delegation unanimously accepted every strict term, voluntarily surrendering national sovereign independence to secure protective alignment with his regional leadership. On February 1, 1958, the United Arab Republic was formally proclaimed, erasing Egyptian and Syrian international borders and installing Nasser as president of a transcontinental Arab Union. When Nasser traveled to Damascus in late February to celebrate unification, global intelligence agencies witnessed the scale of his regional popularity firsthand. Hundreds of thousands of elated Syrian citizens flooded narrow ancient capital streets, abandoning work and school to reach the open-top convertible carrying the Egyptian leader, outgoing Syrian President Shukri al-Quwatli, a pragmatic elder statesman who dedicated his career to Syrian independence, signed unification documents transferring executive authority to Nasser. Following formal ceremonies, Quwatli delivered a prescient warning about Syria's fractured, ungovernable political structure. Quwatli cautioned Nasser that he had inherited a contentious nation of entrenched political figures, where competing factions claimed superior national authority and moral vision. Nasser dismissed the warning, trusting the disciplined military bureaucracy built in Cairo to stabilize Damascus's factionalized political environment permanently. Syria's domestic political realities quickly validated Quwatli's assessment, exposing structural flaws in Nasser's centralized governing model. Nasser dispatched his closest confidant, Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Amer, as supreme governor of the northern province, imposing strict Egyptian military rule over Syria's independent populace. Amer replaced experienced Syrian civilian administrators with loyal Egyptian military personnel, disregarding established tribal and commercial networks structuring Syrian interior governance. To control Syria's fractured political landscape, Nasser replicated Cairo's domestic security framework by implementing an expansive domestic intelligence apparatus. He elevated feared, calculating Syrian intelligence officer Abdel Hamid al-Sarraj, empowering him to dismantle remaining covert political networks in Damascus. Al-Sarraj leveraged integrated internal security resources to purge Syrian military ranks, arresting or retiring veteran commanders who challenged Egyptian administrative authority. Even foundational Ba'ath Party founders, Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Bitar, architects of the Unification Initiative, were excluded from the new union government and pushed into bitter political exile. Dismissive Egyptian administrative attitudes alienated Syria's established professional classes, who recognized their nation had become a territorial subject of Egyptian governance. Political friction escalated into a destructive economic crisis when Cairo attempted to impose Nile Valley socialist land reform models onto Syrian territory. Centralized agricultural quotas failed to account for an unanticipated 3-year regional drought beginning in 1958. ruining core wheat and barley harvests. Nasser additionally ordered nationalization of major Syrian commercial banks and profitable private textile industries, forcing Syria's capitalist economy into Egypt's socialist structural framework. Wealthy Aleppo and Damascus merchant families, who supported union to escape communist economic restructuring, faced state seizure of assets through Cairo's bureaucratic systems. The United Arab Republic, envisioned as a foundational Pan-Arab union, devolved into a resented, policed occupation that drained Egyptian financial and military resources. This systemic administrative failure exposed core paradoxes within Nasser's expanding geopolitical project. Nasser built a potent ideological movement rooted in unifying anti-colonial Arab nationalist rhetoric, yet lacked sophisticated bureaucratic infrastructure to govern a transnational state. Mass civilian crowds believed rhetorical leadership could resolve systemic economic poverty through political oratory alone. This dynamic created an unsustainable psychological cycle, where popular adoration pressured Nasser to project consistent political progress without room for pragmatic adjustment. He became captive to his own public mythology, barred from pragmatic diplomatic retreats that would weaken his standing as an Arab nationalist leader. Cold War geopolitics demanded calculated administrative compromise, while regional public opinion insisted on unyielding ideological resistance. The divide between pragmatic statecraft and popular emotional expectation created an unsustainable governing burden centered entirely on Nasser's individual leadership. Nasser stood at the peak of historical influence, surrounded by supporters expecting transformative geopolitical outcomes, while state administrative and economic systems stalled under structural strain. Reviewing Nasser's regional influence at its 1950s peak marks the apex of his historical ascent. The former working-class son dismantled a corrupt monarchy, expelled British imperial forces, survived tripartite foreign invasion, and unified two sovereign nations under a single governing union. He reshaped stagnant regional political psychology, teaching colonized populations to assert collective demands for national self-determination and political dignity. The tragedy of his pan-Arab vision lay in replacing colonial arbitrary borders with rigid centralized military governance structures. Enduring geopolitical legacy cannot rely on suppression of free thought, as complex societal systems cannot be governed solely through insulated revolutionary council decrees. When military pageantry fades and political rhetoric subsides, nations confront unyielding economic survival realities. Middle Eastern desert sands hold the fractured remnants of ambitious historical empires that sought permanent solutions to complex systems of human governance. Charismatic authoritarianism ultimately replaces foreign imperial constraint with fragile reliance on individual mortal leadership, placing regional economic, military, and cultural survival upon a single individual guarantees eventual systemic collapse. Historical patterns follow unyielding logic. The further individual leadership elevates above institutional administrative realities, the more severe the eventual decline. Monumental infrastructure, large-scale engineering projects, and mass communication outreach represent temporary attempts to halt iterative societal evolution. Permanent national strength derives not from polished public leadership performances, but from resilient civilian institutions built through sustained collective societal effort. The historical era of transformative individual political titans, who sought to rewrite continental destiny through will and conspiracy, yields to gradual temporal erosion. Time acts as ultimate equalizer, fading military prestige, redrawing political boundaries, and reducing ideological conflicts to archived historical record. When crowd fervor fades into desert stillness, core truths of the human condition remain persistent. Universal desires for dignity, household stability, and freedom from state oppression define enduring human experience. These personal human truths outlast transient geopolitical conflict and ambitious state power struggles. As we close the historical record on Nasser's dramatic ascent, release the tension of this layered geopolitical narrative. Allow present stillness to settle over your mind, replacing historical chaos with quiet peace. Recognize large-scale historical currents operate beyond individual control, and personal presence within the broader universe holds inherent value. Release the weight of abstract historical burdens, and find solace in steady personal rhythm amid ongoing global change. Good night.